The SCP Foundation is no stranger to pure evil. Whether it's a reptile that wants to end all life, a sadistic old man with his own torture dimension, or the personification of death itself lurking beyond a limestone cavern. But what if there was something even worse out there? The embodiment of chaos and cruelty, existing across multiple realities and dimensions. And what if it was coming for us? This is the Scarlet King, believed by many to be the ultimate evil behind much of the trouble the Foundation has faced, and some even speculate that fighting him was the reason the Foundation was created in the first place. But what exactly is the Scarlet King? He's known by many names, almost always including some allusion to the color red, and then a reference to royalty or power. Harak, Kaharak, the Red Shah, the Crimson Khan, PTE 616 Mendez Ex Machina, the Laha Raja, and, of course, SCP-001, to name a few. And like many of the Foundation's mysterious enemies, stories about his true nature and origins abound and are often contradictory. According to the official SCP-001 files of Tufto's proposal, symbology of the Scarlet King has existed in multiple cultures throughout history, with the king often depicted the same way, as a huge red demonic figure, often wearing a gold crown or other headdress indicating royalty. He shows up looking similarly within different cultures' mythologies, despite existing at different points in history or them not having the means to communicate with one another. A number of entities that the SCP Foundation is familiar with are believed to be somehow connected to the Scarlet King, including SCP-2317, a wooden door leading to the realm of a being known as the Devourer, who's expected to escape and cause an apocalyptic event in the next 30 years. But really, there's no way of knowing just how many SCPs are directly connected to the Scarlet King. Strangely, the Foundation's official file on the Scarlet King once designated his containment class as Keter, but that has since been downgraded to Safe. According to the file, any attempt to change this designation is likely to lead to horrifying results. It is widely known that the Scarlet King still has considerable influence over a number of groups, individuals, and anomalies in our universe. And if ever he made his way into our universe, it would likely lead to the irreversible damage of reality itself. So then why Safe? And why are the O5 Council so adamant that it remain that way? Getting to the bottom of this mystery is exactly why we're here today. But to fully grasp the true nature of the Scarlet King, we must first understand the man whose life and fate have always been tied to it, Dr. Robert Montauk. If that name feels oddly familiar to you, it's because of its association with one of the Scarlet King's most recent attempts to enter our reality, SCP-231. This SCP, often referred to as the Brides of the Scarlet King, was formed of 7 women. 7, by the way, being an extremely significant number for the king, all kidnapped by the most recent in a long line of the king's devoted cults known as the Children of the Scarlet King. Each of these 7 unfortunate women were impregnated with anomalous horrors, such as the infamous SCP-682, and every time one of these horrors were birthed, a catastrophe occurred and the mother died. At the time, Dr. Montauk was a prominent researcher studying this anomaly, and as 6 catastrophes had already occurred, pressure was mounting to figure out a way to prevent the final birth. But as he was working on the issue, Dr. Montauk was struck with a personal tragedy, the mysterious disappearance of his 14-year-old brother Jacob. In his fear and anger, Montauk believed that this must have something to do with the Scarlet King and his disciples. Wanting revenge, Montauk proposed an idea so horrifying that the details were never made public. A procedure known as 110 Montauk, to be performed on the final bride at regular intervals. However, this wasn't the end of Dr. Montauk's fraught relationship with the Scarlet King. It was just the beginning. To give you some perspective on just how dangerous the Scarlet King is, the SCP Foundation and the Global Occult Coalition decided to put aside their differences and form a joint effort to stamp out the children of the Scarlet King. They were successful in this mission, and even managed to capture the children's leader, a mysterious man named Depeche Spivak. Dr. Montauk, who became the lead researcher on 231 and 2317, was naturally the first choice for interviewing Depeche about the true nature of the children and of the Scarlet King. Dr. Montauk could never be the impartial interviewer that the SCP Foundation wanted, though. The suspicion that the Scarlet King or the children had something to do with the loss of his younger brother still lingered just beneath the surface. Like a lot of cult leaders, Depeche was extremely cryptic in his answers to Dr. Montauk's questioning. He'd already heard of the doctor from the reputation of the horrifying Montauk procedure, and was surprised to see him so calm and courteous in person. A few key facts about the king and his cult were revealed in the first few rounds of questioning. The children had once worked with the Serpent's Hand before being excommunicated for their allegiance to the king, and they had stolen sacred texts from the mystical Wanderer's Library to assist in their summoning rituals. Depeche also revealed that the Scarlet King is bound by 3 laws: the law of blood, the law of concrete, and the law of howling. Dr. Montauk, confused and frustrated by Depeche's secrecy, had to learn more. He found an old memoir from a former member of the Children of the Scarlet King, Jack Hirsch, who had the ability to invade the minds of people from the past and experience what they experienced. He recounted a battle between the Scarlet King and his followers and a group of time-traveling Turkmen warriors from SCP-3838. Hurst saw both sides of the battle. From the perspective of the Children of the Scarlet King, their lord ruled over them from an immense fortress embedded in a volcano. From the perspective of the Turkmen, the children were starved and beaten peasants, commanded by the king's voice in the roaring howl of the wind. Montauk also found extensive records of summoning rituals performed by various Scarlet King-aligned cults. Interestingly, some of them incorporated the use of carved SCP Foundation symbols. What could this mean? Montauk returned again to Depeche, who finally gave him the truth about the law of blood. This is the law of the Scarlet King. It's defined by poverty, violence, starvation, hate, and most of all, fear. Like the serfs in the Middle Ages, persecuted by and subjected to violence from the nobles. To the Children of the Scarlet King, this sense of holy pain and awe is the only way to live. The alternative is the law of concrete, which means the modern age defined by empty safety and false comfort. Buildings, easy-to-access food, healthcare, knowledge, technology. This is everything that the Scarlet King despises. But the mystery only deepened as Montauk found files from a former Foundation operative by the name of Agent de Beauvoir. Montauk learned that the Scarlet King didn't seem to appear until after the Foundation was created. And in fact, it seemed that the greater interest the Foundation took in the Scarlet King, the more powerful he became. How could this be? Things were also getting stranger on a personal level for Dr. Montauk. Depeche repeatedly pressed him about his brother's disappearance and the Montauk procedure during the interviews. Little by little, it was beginning to take its toll. The questions still plagued him. What was the law of howling? Who or what really is the Scarlet King? How did he come to be? Montauk's search was causing him to act more like the Children of the Scarlet King, ranting about the horrors of the modern world, how all of us are living a lie, how the only honest way to live is suffering under the dominion of the Scarlet King. This philosophy is summed up in the words of one cultist named Ariadne Cartwright, who said, "We must learn what it is to die, to be enslaved, truly, brutally enslaved, with no compassion or compunction from our masters. We must learn what it is to be taken towards a single purpose, to know and truly understand our lack of agency. We must be beholden to the words of gods and darkness, the tempest-tossed refuse of a race of fools. We must kill modernity, postmodernity, with all its analysis and sneering observation. There is only one rule, the rule of chaos, for humanity, for life, for the Scarlet King. Basically, anytime humanity tries to exert control over the world, the Scarlet King gets stronger. Every time they try to understand or organize or categorize their world, the Scarlet King gets stronger. As colonial and imperial powers conquered and invaded lands like India, Africa, and South America, and subjugated their beliefs under Western ideas, the Scarlet King grew stronger. Montauk was beginning to truly understand the power of his enemy here, and even worse, he was starting to understand his part in it. Montauk, slowly being driven mad by the knowledge he was gaining, realized that the Scarlet King's greatest enemy, the SCP Foundation, was also its greatest asset. Every time they tried to understand the monster, to give him some kind of comprehensible form, they only made him more powerful. Just in time with Montauk's new revelation, a red crack appeared in the wall of Depeche Spivak's containment cell, a portal to the realm of the Scarlet King. Foundation staff found they were unable to enter the cell, and Depeche demanded a final interview with Montauk. With no other options, the Foundation relented. In their very last conversation, Depeche congratulated Montauk for finally understanding what he was dealing with. The Scarlet King, Depeche told him, is an idea, a concept. He is a being given power through the conflict between the old and the new. This is the law of the Howling. The Scarlet King's endless rage at the direction the world and humanity has taken. The King, according to Depeche, hated the Foundation's belief that science and rationality was the true path to progress. The King saw this as little more than petty arrogance. The reason Montauk's procedure on the final bride of the Scarlet King was so effective was because it wasn't born out of science. It was born out of hate, pain, the desire for revenge, and in the Scarlet King's realm, that would be all there is. Unless our world, and especially the Foundation, changed its course, the Scarlet King's rise to absolute power would be inevitable. Montauk, his mind practically gone, asked one last question. Did the children or the Scarlet King take his brother, Jacob? When Depeche told him the answer, no, and in response, Montauk shot him dead, finally bringing an end to the children of the Scarlet King. In light of his new revelations, Montauk begged the O5 Council to change their ways in order to avoid letting the Scarlet King break into our reality. They refused, saying Montauk's ideas were too radical. But they knew they couldn't just ignore the threat posed by the Scarlet King. They would have to take some steps. And so the O5 Council of the SCP Foundation, the most powerful and secretive group in the entire world, in order to prevent the most dangerous threat that humanity has ever known from breaking into our reality and enslaving all the people of the world, finally did something. They changed the classification of the Scarlet King from Keter to Safe, and made its description on the official Foundation files deliberately vague. The O5 Council thinks this will be enough to stop the Scarlet King's power from continuing to grow, but Montauk knew it wasn't enough. He had seen the truth, and he couldn't unsee it. While the Foundation was going on as normal, Montauk grew to despise them. He knew the Scarlet King was coming. He knew that he couldn't be stopped, and that our whole reality was little more than sitting ducks. Dr. Robert Montauk is no longer a researcher for the SCP Foundation. No, Dr. Robert Montauk chose a different path. He's now a child of the Scarlet King, a devotee of madness, hate, and chaos. You can't beat the Scarlet King after all, and as the old adage goes, if you can't beat him, join him. Have you ever seen something you weren't supposed to? Something that made you feel off? Something you regret? Secrets like these are best kept to yourself. But since you're still alive, Whatever you saw wasn't nearly as bad as what Peter Holland saw one fateful night in January of 2015. Peter was an unremarkable man, an office worker, slaving away at the daily grind. And like a lot of people, Peter enjoyed nothing more than coming home after a long, hard day, kicking back and watching some TV. It was this innocent activity that led to Peter's horrifying brush with SCP-5049, altering the course of his otherwise average life forever. The event started at around 10:05 p.m. Peter was channel surfing, glued to the couch in his sparsely furnished apartment. Commercials, commercials, commercials. As far as Peter's tired eyes could see. He paused for a moment to watch the end of an ad for a car he could never hope to afford on his salary. But something stopped him from changing the channel again. The next ad had begun, and it was playing a strange, scratchy jingle that gave Peter an odd sense of unease. But even stranger than that was the text on screen. Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot in baby blue bubble lettering. He forced a smile. This had to be some weird comedy skit or viral marketing campaign, or maybe it was something he drank. But no, this was a real commercial, and things were about to get even weirder. The peppy logo faded to a concerning sight. A tall humanoid figure dressed like a used car salesman, but one that definitely wasn't human. His skin was dark green and covered in patches of thick fur. He had long fingers with intimidating claws and a grin full of needle-like fangs. It looked almost demonic, and after a few seconds, the demon began to speak.
Hey there, folks, it's your man, Demon Dan, coming at you with the latest and greatest deals from Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. We've just accepted a shipment of brand new models that would make even the most discerning customers weep with excitement. Let's see what we've got.
The creature, apparently named Demon Dan, stepped away from his desk, revealing two long, furry goat legs that ended in large, pointed hooves. Peter now assumed he really was going crazy, but at this point he was along for the ride. Demon Dan continued his pitch.
Looking to make your way through the capitalist hellscape that makes home look cozy? Come try one of our newest businessman models.
Dan gestured behind him to where Peter was horrified to see a total of 52 adult male human bodies hanging from a wall. There was something uncanny about them. They seemed almost hollow, like a highly realistic costume or a prop from a horror movie. Peter didn't have much time to think about it though, as Demon Dan went on.
If you're looking for an extra challenge of inequality, the businesswoman model may be a right fit for you.
The commercial then revealed a wall of human female bodies strung up in a similar fashion.
Now, you may be thinking, but Dan, business sounds hard, I just want to have some fun. And the fine team here at Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot have got you covered.
The camera zoomed out to show an area of the store filled with children's decorations, and more of these strange, hollowed-out human suits in child sizes to match.
And who has more fun than kids? No one, that's who. For a limited time, the purchase of any child-size unit comes with a complimentary 50% off coupon for parental units. You just can't say no to a deal like that.
Before Peter could process the madness that was unfolding before him, the camera cut again. The store's logo appeared on the screen once more, along with several cuts to locations around the store itself. There were more human bodies, hundreds of them. Demon Dan's sleazy voice rang out over all of it.
Here at Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, we know it's not all fun and games. The bravest among us have a mission to accomplish. The Seven Lords are ever planning their invasion after all, so you're looking for function over form. Well, we've got that in spades down here in the Tactical Services Department. You'll be kicking ass in no time when you're wearing the latest models at the best prices.
Seven Lords? Invasion? What did any of this mean? Suddenly, the camera was showing him a new room. Red curtains parted, revealing more of these person suits, several bearing a striking resemblance to real human celebrities. He managed to make out Gucci Mane, Avril Lavigne, Paul McCartney, and Britney Spears before Demon Dan's appearance once again drew his attention.
I've got a special treat for you. We're happy to announce the VIP Lookalike Department. We all know how difficult the creation of Homunculus is. It's a fine art that takes years of practice. So when a replacement order on VIPs comes in, every detail needs to be perfect. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. But for the right price, you too can look like famous icons from around the globe.
The image of celebrity bodies faded from view, and Peter was left looking at the grinning Demon Dan standing behind the front desk of his impossible store once more. He said,
"There you have it, folks. Come on down to Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. If you're viewing the advertisement, then you've been selected for entry. Please enter the nearest door for instant deals and upgrade those old duds for one of our newest models. What are you waiting for? Come on down."
The logo popped up again, hovering above some bold text that said, "Please enter the nearest door." Peter had had enough. He switched off the TV. What a horror show, he thought. They should just warn you before they put short horror films on TV like that. He had no idea they could just slip them in among regular commercials. Surely Demon Dan and his store couldn't be real, right? But as his eyes drifted to the door in his room, he didn't feel quite so certain. Well, there was only one way to find out. Peter got up, went over to the door, took a deep breath, and walked through it. Peter Holland was never seen again, not as himself, anyway. The SCP Foundation has long been aware of this sinister transmission, known as SCP-5049-2, and luckily has found ways to prevent it from claiming more victims. The Foundation Television Analysis Department, as well as webcrawler 40Y40, which is the software the Foundation uses to root out anomalous activity online, are always vigilant for signs of Demon Dan's commercial running. Just observing Demon Dan, who is himself classified as SCP-5049-A, and his ads put you in immediate danger, as it can transform any nearby doors into SCP-5049-1s. Those are interdimensional portals that remain active for around 15 minutes after viewing the ad. So then what specifically is SCP-5049? It's the entire pocket dimension known as Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, a Kettier-class spatial anomaly constantly on the lookout for new human victims, which it transforms into fleshy suits for its demonic clients, which let them blend in around humans. Prior to its discovery by the Foundation, it's likely that Demon Dan and his associates claimed hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. But sadly, even discovering this anomaly came at a gruesome cost to the Foundation. On February 16, 2020, the ad played on Safe Storage Warehouse 13's break room television. At the time of the broadcast, 4 Foundation personnel were present, including Security Agent William Birkin. Worrying that this was a potential security threat, Agent Birkin investigated the door to a nearby closet. The second he opened it, he was transformed to the storefront of Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot. He saw Demon Dan himself standing at the corner, while 4 smaller reptilian imps fought over a small flesh suit. Demon Dan scolded them, before turning his attention to Agent Birkin.
Tis, you aren't supposed to be here, little man. How naughty. I'm gonna have to have a word with marketing once I'm through with you.
Agent Birkin, fearing for his safety, drew his weapon and shot Demon Dan 3 times. The creature dematerialized, before appearing right next to Agent Birkin and disarming him with a swift chop. The unfortunate security agent was then grabbed by the considerably larger Demon Dan and thrown over Dan's shoulder. We know all of this because Agent Birkin's standard issue Foundation body camera recorded the whole terrifying ordeal, even as Demon Dan dragged the helpless Birkin back into the twisted workshop behind the store. There, Birkin saw what would soon be his own fate right before his eyes. Dan's minions converting human bodies into fleshy suits for their demon clientele, and this unfortunate security officer was next. Dan gave him over to a pair of large sheep-like demons, and told them to drain, skin, and declaw him. Birkin's video feed finally cut as the demons pulled out their rusty tools and began to work on him. Of course, the SCP Foundation wouldn't take an attack on one of their operatives, inside one of their facilities no less, lying down. The unfortunate death of William Birkin allowed the Foundation to refine their methods of intercepting the broadcast of Demon Dan's commercials. They even had a new mobile task force, Mobile Strike Force Kappa 11, or the Baphomet Bashers, specifically to deal with Demon Dan and his cronies. They did more than just prevent him from taking new humans, though. when the Baphomet Bashers teamed up with an A-class clairvoyant entity to improve their efficiency in predicting future broadcasts. They were able to launch sting operations and arrest 21 different demonic customers for interrogation. This impressive strike back finally gave the Foundation some meaningful leverage over Demon Dan. And through the use of their clairvoyant entity, they were able to call a temporary truce and arrange a meeting with Demon Dan himself. Captain Steiner, an agent of the Foundation External Negotiation Department, was the one to interrogate Demon Dan. They sat across from each other at a table, and Demon Dan was clearly tense, frustrated with the way the Foundation had been messing with his business. All of their sting operations were frightening off his customers. In return for letting him continue his work, the Foundation wanted Dan to turn over all the information on his bosses and customers, allowing the Foundation to track their movements. When Dan was evasive about whether he'd comply, they tried threatening him. Dan laughed them off.
Go ahead, take your best shot, little man. There's a dozen more just like me. You won't stop anything.
Finally, he was pressured into giving a yes or no answer as to whether he'd willingly collaborate with the Foundation and act as an informant against his kind. When Demon Dan hinted that he may be willing to comply, he began to make a horrifying gurgling noise and gripped his head in pain. He began speaking in Latin in a voice that wasn't his own, as though the 7 demon lords he served were speaking through him. They said, "You are a fool, jailer, to think a pathetic morsel such as this could aid you against us. I have allowed you to toil in your own delusions for far too long. You may have taken advantage of Asmodeus all those years ago, but you stop nothing. You hinder nothing. You jail and barter to no avail. Your time is coming." And then Demon Dan's head exploded, which obviously prevented him from giving any incriminating information on those he worked for. Whoever the Demon Lords are, they're certainly the secretive type. You may think that this is the end of Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot and of SCP-5049, but soon another ad ran. It advertised the same products and services out of the same store. The only difference was that this time, a different entity was starring in it. The SCP Foundation does their best to live up to their famous namesake. They secure and contain anomalies and monsters from all around the world, or sometimes even off-world, and protect the public from the dangers that these strange entities might pose. However, despite their efforts to maintain security and keep their subjects under lock and key, there are sometimes creatures so clever, so devious, and so determined to escape their captivity and wreak havoc on the world that even the SCP Foundation struggles to keep them from getting free. One example is SCP-035, or the Possessive Mask. SCP-035 is one of the most dangerous test subjects in SCP Foundation custody, and its mere presence at the Foundation has resulted in untold damage, death, and destruction. It seems innocent enough to the untrained eye. The mask, which resembles a classic white porcelain comedy mask, though it occasionally changes its expression to tragedy, has been in existence since at least the 1800s. In the late 19th century, the Foundation discovered the mask in a sealed crypt beneath an abandoned home in Venice. It is unknown how it got there, or how the Foundation knew to look for it. If there was ever an explanation for its discovery, it has long since been removed or redacted from the Foundation's archives. You're probably wondering, how can a simple mask leave multiple seasoned Foundation employees dead? Well, like everything at the SCP Foundation, this mask is not what it seems. There is a reason its classification is Keter, a designation that refers to an entity that's excessively difficult to contain, and it couples this difficulty with a pronounced hostility towards human life, and the ability to cause widespread destruction in the event of a containment breach. These are the qualities that the poor unfortunate souls assigned to guard SCP-035 would come to understand all too well. The Possessive Mask is a parasitic entity, constantly seeking out a host willing to put it on. Any human being in the mask's proximity experiences a sudden, unexplainable urge to put it on, and once they do, there's no going back. SCP Foundation research has determined that once a host has put on the mask, their brain waves are replaced with an alternative pattern, this one coming from the mask, rendering the host effectively brain dead. Once the host's brain function has been eliminated, the mask takes over, piloting their body and even speaking through them. However, the mask can only occupy a host for a small amount of time before the body begins to decay and decompose, eventually rotting away completely, leaving nothing but desiccated flesh and bones where there once was a person. SCP-035 is capable of possessing any humanoid being, whether that's an actual human being or a lifeless humanoid shape. Despite all their research, the SCP Foundation unknowingly gave the mask all the tools and resources it needed to break containment and leave a trail of bodies in its wake. For a time, the mask was given host privileges, meaning that it was purposely allowed to occupy a host in order to speak with the scientists studying it. In order to avoid murky ethical issues, the host was usually something inanimate like a mannequin or a statue. These conditions, however unsettling, allowed the researchers to carry out interviews with the consciousness housed inside the mask, in the hope of beginning to understand it and its motivations. However, SCP-035 lost all access to its host privileges after it almost pulled off an unprecedented, shocking, and nearly catastrophic escape attempt. In its early days at the facility, when it was still allowed host privileges, it was contained in a triple-locked room and monitored by several research personnel. These were experienced researchers who had been with the Foundation for a minimum of 5 years each, an unusually long tenure in such a dangerous and mentally corrosive line of work. These research staff members were thought to be the most capable of handling interactions with the mask and be able to resist its attempts at manipulation. Unfortunately, these assumptions were naive and seriously underestimated the mask's power. Research on the mask indicates that the mask is incredibly intelligent and a skilled manipulator. It has a photographic memory, intelligence that would rank it in the 99th percentile of humans, and the ability to incite dramatic changes in the behavior and people that it talks to. One particularly infamous interview between the entity and an unnamed doctor at the Foundation suggested that the mask may even possess telepathic abilities. The mask was able to give details about the doctor's life that no one else was privy to, including knowledge of an affair that his wife was having. Following the interview, the doctor suffered a psychotic break and committed suicide just 24 hours later. The mask is able to use its superior intelligence, charismatic personality, and mind-reading abilities to get inside the heads of those it speaks with. It will pull out any and all psychological stops to get what it wants, leaving broken minds and spirits in its wake. It was really only a matter of time before it used this skill set to its advantage and attempted to escape its confinement. The day of the escape attempt was like any other. The research staff, a team of 3 intelligent, experienced men, checked into the facility, measured the conditions of the mask's containment unit, and began the process of interviewing the mask like normal. Its motions were slow and looked to require great effort, as its current host was beginning to degrade beyond use. The mask was attached to the blank face of a mannequin, and corrosive black liquid could be seen oozing from its eye and mouth holes. This liquid is excreted by the mask at a near constant rate, and it's thought to be at least partially responsible for the accelerated decay of the host bodies. In spite of the entity's unsettling, nightmarish appearance, it was just another day's work for the men assigned to monitor SCP-035, and so they carried on with their daily routine. Everything was going according to plan until one of the men, Dr. Jones, began to behave erratically. He demanded that his fellow scientists leave him alone with the mask for a while and allow him to engage in a private conversation with it. It is unknown what exactly the two spoke about while the other 2 scientists were absent, as the security footage captured had no sound. However, several minutes into the conversation in the footage, Dr. Jones can be seen dissolving into a fit of tears, laying on the ground and shaking with sobs as the mask dispassionately watches. He then climbs onto his knees, begging the mask for something, before he embraces it. He holds the mannequin in his arms for 5 straight minutes, weeping again before they separate. After this disturbing emotional display, Dr. Jones brought the other scientists back into the room with him. What happened next is still uncertain, but there are a few things that we know for sure. The other scientists began to speak with the mask. In later interviews, the other scientists were bordering on incoherent babbling about various traumas from their lives. One repeatedly referred to a drunk driving accident where a dear friend was killed, and he was at fault. Another simply cried out for his mother again and again. Whatever the mask said to them, it was enough to completely destroy their mental health. After the 2 scientists had been emotionally devastated by the mask, Dr. Jones escalated the situation further. Dr. Jones removed the mask from the decaying mannequin body and shocking everyone who had later reviewed the security footage, placed it onto his own face. Once the mask was in place, the security footage ends. At the command of the mask, which was now speaking through Dr. Jones, the other two men switched off all security camera monitoring SCP-035's containment facility. The mask, piloting the body of Dr. Jones like a horrible fleshy puppet, made its way through the facility, avoiding detection until it reached the exit doors, where it was finally stopped by a team of over a dozen security guards. Knowing the dangers of touching the mask, all Foundation employees involved in the recontainment of SCP-035 refused to remove it from Dr. Jones' face. Instead, he was placed in the lock room with the mask still on, left alone to be observed over the security cameras until his body had decomposed beyond use. His body paced back and forth in the cell for days, flesh rotting and dropping away only until sinew and bone remained. Only when the bones began to turn black and brittle, crumbling apart into dust, did the body finally stop moving. His family was notified, the mask was carefully removed from what was left of his body, and his remains were destroyed. The other two scientists involved in the SCP-035 escape attempt were terminated, and their files destroyed. After this incident, a few more failed escape attempts, and the acknowledgement of the devastation that could have been caused if the mask had made its way out into the general population, SCP-035 lost its host privileges altogether. Several research staff protested this decision, insisting that there was more to be learned from speaking with the entity, and citing valuable information that it had given about other SCPs. However, the risk was determined to considerably outweigh the potential reward, and the request to reinstate 035's host privileges were denied. Several staff members went so far as to erupt into violent outbursts on 035's behalf, attacking their supervisors who refused to provide the mask with a new host, clawing at them with animalistic rage. Any staff members that submitted a request to reinstate said privileges were considered a security threat and reassigned to a different SCP, or in some cases, terminated. Any staff member who had direct contact with SCP-035 was also terminated, in order to avoid the risk of any more staff-aided escape attempts. The mask is now kept in a hermetically sealed glass case, and there is a psychologist on call to provide assistance to anyone guarding it, in case of adverse effects on their mental health from the mask's presence. Personnel that work around the mask, even in its current dormant state, experience frequent violent outbursts and a higher rate of suicide. Even without a host, the mask's corrosive effects have spread across its containment facility. The walls of the room have begun to secrete the same black liquid that emanates from the mask, which tests have revealed to be highly contaminated human blood that damages the structural integrity of the walls following prolonged contact. This blood has begun to form patterns on the walls, spelling out words and phrases in Italian, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, as well as depicting drawings of ritual sacrifice and mutilation. Staff members also report hearing unintelligible whispering and horrifying high-pitched laughter when in proximity to the mask. Further exposure to the mask results in migraines, hemorrhaging around the eyes, mouth, and nose, and an eventual psychotic break. Between the corrosive substance appearing on the walls and the physical and psychological damage to employees, SCP-035 is becoming increasingly difficult to contain, and there are debates among staff as to whether the entity can, in fact, be contained at all. As soon as possible, SCP-035 will be moved into a new containment facility, and its previous cell will be isolated from the rest of the Foundation's property and destroyed for the safety of all involved. We can only hope that the new containment procedures are more effective than the last ones, and that this mask never makes its way into the world again. If it does, who knows how many lives it will claim. In the meantime, if you ever come across a strange mask and feel a nearly uncontrollable urge to put it on, ignore the whispered pleas to just try it. Ignore the echoing laughter and the sensation of something older and more powerful than you can imagine rummaging through your deepest, darkest, secret thoughts. Turn around and run as fast as you can in the other direction. You'll be glad that you did.
Addiction. It takes many forms and wears many faces, like a demon walking among us. It takes over your life, crawling in and changing you from the inside out. Breaking an addiction is hard, but oftentimes not giving it up is much harder. That was a difficult lesson to learn for 3 people: Joey Walker, Dolly McGregor, and Paul Abels. These 3 had never met one another, and now they never will. But each one of them had 2 things in common.
First was that each had an addiction they felt like they couldn't shake, and second was that they each had a run-in with SCP-666. Joey Walker was at the end of his rope when he encountered it. Everyone has bad days, but for Joey, every day for the last 15 years has been a bad day. He was pushing 40 with nothing to show for it, except credit card debt, a scraggly beard, and a beat-up old Mustang. But booze had always been there for him. No matter how bad things got, he could always count on a glass full of comfort at the end of the day. But to paraphrase a quote by Stephen King, sometimes when a man takes a drink, the drink takes the man. And Joey Walker had been long since taken. He was a transient worker, doing jobs wherever jobs needed doing, but he never expected that he would end up all the way to Tibet working construction. Not that he was complaining. Sure, it was cold, but there was plenty of Tibetan Chang to enjoy. It was a drink so good that legends even say that Yetis would raid villages in the mountains just to get a little taste. Joey had taken a liking to the Chang, and it was what he had been drinking when he crashed his car up in the mountains, leaving him stranded in the snow. Joey had survived the crash itself, but he knew he wouldn't last long in the cold. He needed shelter. That's why he felt like he could hardly believe his luck when he first saw the yurt, a kind of traditional Tibetan tent made from animal skins. Joey had never seen anything quite like it, but any refuge from the storm would do. He pushed forward through the snow and climbed inside. But the inside of the yurt was nothing like the outside. In fact, it seemed like an exact replica of his favorite sports bar back in Atlantic City. It was warm. There was all the old memorabilia on the walls, and every screen was showing the Saints wiping the floor with the Colts in the 2010 Super Bowl. Joey didn't even question it. He just smiled and approached the bar. He even recognized the bartender, Malcolm, a good old friend of his. Malcolm smiled back at him, but there was something oddly menacing in his grin. "Welcome back," he said. "I thought you'd hauled your sorry keister off to Tibet. Guess you gave up on that too, just like everything else." "Well, except..." Malcolm pushed a glass of beer towards him across the bar and glared. Joey didn't understand why Malcolm was being so aggressive, but he didn't question that either. He grabbed the glass and drank it up, guzzling it down before slamming the empty glass down on the bar. Malcolm kept the drinks coming, round after round, and Joey kept knocking them back. He didn't notice when the TV screens turned to static. He didn't notice when the other patrons at the bar began to jitter and twitch, turning little by little into something less than human. He didn't even notice when Malcolm's face started melting off his skull as long as he kept pouring. Before he could even really understand what was happening to him, Joey Walker was dead. His liver and kidneys had given out on him. His corpse would later be found frozen on the Tibetan mountainside, just 30 feet away from his crashed car. The coroner's report would list his cause of death as accidental, but this was no accident. He'd fallen victim to SCP-666, an anomalous yurt known to some as the Spirit House. The being he'd call Malcolm is known to the Foundation as SCP-666-1, and Joey had failed its challenge. Sadly for our inebriated friend, the penalty for failure is death. Next on our list of human tragedies comes Dolly McGregor, a 62-year-old woman from Anaheim, California. Dolly was never averse to the drink, but she knew how to enjoy her mojitos in moderation. You rarely get to 62 if you don't, and Dolly could tell people with pride that she had 2 children and 6 grandchildren, whom she didn't see nearly often enough for her liking. She also had over $100,000 in gambling debt owed to a number of casinos on the Vegas Strip. Ever since her husband Albert had passed away several years prior, shooting craps, playing blackjack, and willing away the hours in front of the slot machines had been a welcome change from loneliness. But in Vegas, fortunes can change in an instant. Dolly had gone from being on a hot winning streak to losing everything. The casinos extended her lines of credit until she was gambling with money she'd never be able to pay back. But that didn't stop her. She'd been selling off everything, even remortgaging the house that Albert had built with his own 2 hands to try and keep up with her ballooning debts. Still, it wasn't enough, but she couldn't stop either. It wasn't even that she felt good about it anymore. It was just that she only ever felt normal among the flashing lights of slot machines and the clatter of dice. She needed to get away. as far away as possible. She heard about people reaching spiritual enlightenment in Tibet. They'd discover God or gods, or sometimes just a sense of inner peace. Whatever it was, she needed to find it and get this demon off her back. So she took the last of her savings and flew off to Tibet to clear her head. She didn't know if there were any casinos in Lhasa, but if there were, her money would surely be no good there. It was exactly what she needed. But Tibet wasn't the promised land she thought it would be. Wherever Dolly went, there she was, with the same vices and demons chasing her. The first night she spent in Lhasa, she used the hotel Wi-Fi to download an online poker app on her phone. This culminated in another couple $1,000s lost, and a panic attack that caused Dolly to throw her phone into her toilet before wandering off into the wilderness. She just needed to get away. But time and space got away from her, and eventually she was knee-deep in snow. Where had she come from? Where could she go? It quickly dawned on her that if she didn't find some kind of shelter soon, she'd be done for. But all she could do was keep walking. That's when she happened upon SCP-666. The yurt was like an oasis on the barren mountainside. She didn't expect comfort inside, but it could at least provide her some shelter until the staff back at the hotel noticed she was gone. Then they'd come and save her, right? Right. But when she passed through the yak leather flap into the yurt, Dolly wasn't in an ancient tent in the Tibetan wilderness. She was on a casino floor. There was a big, beautiful roulette table before her, attended to by a grinning, well-dressed croupier. They were flanked by an army of slot machines, and all the pleasing, familiar sounds of cheerful gambling rang out through the air. She approached the table and the croupier shook his head in what seemed like disappointment. Back again, eh, Dolly? He said with a sigh. Of course, I should have expected it. After all, what else do you have in that empty little life of yours, Without all this, you'd be nothing, right? Nothing at all. Since Albert died and the kids want nothing to do with you, we're all you've got. So, Dolly, what'll it be? Red or black? Are you feeling lucky? His words wounded Dolly, but that wouldn't stop her. She grabbed her chips and put them all on red. One last spin couldn't hurt. What did she have to lose? She blinked, and she wasn't sitting at the table anymore. She was upright, but she wasn't standing. Her wrists and ankles were bound to something, to a wheel. A giant roulette wheel, like it was some kind of medieval torture device. The croupier was standing across from her, well, something that used to be a croupier. His face was flickering in and out. Sometimes it was human, sometimes it was a mass of eyes and teeth. More demons were sitting all at the slot machines behind him, pulling levers made from human bones. Good choice, Dolly, the croupier said. Red suits you. He reached out and gave the wheel a spin. Dolly was lost in an overwhelming, pulsing cascade of lights, colors, and sounds. The horrific tinny noises of slot machines and the laughter of the demonic croupier. She was lost in panic and terror as she just kept spinning and spinning and spinning. When her body was eventually found, her muscles were in the advanced stages of atrophy, as though she hadn't been moving for years. Her brain was rotted, and the cause of death was determined as sudden cardiac arrest after an extended period of sleep deprivation and malnutrition. Dolly's family would never really know what happened to her. The SCP Foundation has learned a lot about SCP-666 after containing it in Site-73. Its anomalous effects, namely vivid, complex, and potentially fatal hallucinatory experiences, only affect those with some kind of addiction or dependency. To anyone else entering the yurt, it's just a normal tent. But any addicts who enter will fall under its spell, and are generally transported back to the place where their addiction was at its strongest. There they'll encounter SCP-666-1, an entity that takes the form of a figure from the subject's life, normally one heavily involved in facilitating their addiction. Any kind of addiction seems to trigger it. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, food, self-destructive behavior, even video games. SCP-666 kills its victims with a twisted mockery of the very thing that they were dependent on in life. It was only with Paul Abels that the Foundation started discovering the other side of the coin. By almost all accounts, Paul is a worse person than anyone on this list. He got addicted to hard drugs early on in life, and took up a life of violent crime to support his habit. He murdered 2 people during a liquor store robbery before being convicted and sentenced to death. He'd then been picked up as a D-class by the SCP Foundation, and selected as a test subject for SCP-666 due to his history of drug abuse. The Foundation expected to be adding his body to the incineration pile sometime soon. None of the researchers working on the case predicted what actually ended up happening. Paul was forced to enter the yurt. Not long after, he found himself standing in a place he'd done everything to try to forget. The dark graffiti-stained alley where he'd been sold his first hit. This was the place that destroyed his life. Every bad decision he'd ever made could be traced back to here, and specifically to one man, Frank. Frank was his first dealer, and now here he was, standing right across from him once more. Frank was grinning like a demon.
"Come on, Polly," he said. "You gotta trash. We both know what you're gonna do. Don't you feel it? The itch? Come on, one more hit, Polly. That's all you need to feel better. It's time to take your medicine."
Frank, or this thing pretending to be Frank, was right. He did feel the itch. He did want it. Maybe he was no better than this. He began to reach out towards Frank, but then he abruptly pulled his hand back. Frank's eyes widened in genuine surprise as Paul replied, "I'm sorry, that's not me anymore." SCP-666-1 gave a smile and said,
"Maybe it isn't, Polly. Maybe it isn't."
When Paul Abels was removed from the SCP-666 yurt by one of the attending guards, the Foundation researchers discovered something amazing. Paul was very much alive, and more incredibly, he didn't feel the cravings anymore. His addiction was gone, and further tests showed that Paul wasn't a one-off event. In fact, anyone who denies the temptation of SCP-666 will see their addictions miraculously disappear when they finally leave. After this, it became clear to the Foundation that SCP-666 isn't just a way to punish addicts. It's a kind of test. Those who want to change, who are willing to truly confront their demons and resist the pull of temptation, are rewarded with the one thing they want most in their life: freedom from their addiction. SCP-666 can be your doom or your salvation, and like most things in life, you get what you give. SCP-682 must be destroyed as soon as possible. So begins the SCP Foundation file on the dreaded SCP-682, a highly intelligent reptilian monster that has, despite the Foundation's best efforts, proved impossible to kill. It may not be the most dangerous SCP out there, considering that some are capable of eliminating entire realities, but it's one of the most iconic. And you've probably heard tales of the monster that death forgot, and you know exactly why everyone is so afraid of the so-called hard-to-kill reptile. It's been subjected to some of the most deadly weapons and traps the Foundation could devise, and survived attacks from some of its deadliest fellow SCPs. But before we tell you about the Foundation's many failed assassination attempts against the so-called hard-to-kill reptile, we need a little more groundwork on what this creature even is. The first thing to know about SCP-682 is that this thing wants you and everything you know dead. Unlike some other creatures like SCP-096 and SCP-173, which are murderous but exhibit no real higher processing skills, SCP-682 possesses cunning, advanced reasoning, and even human-level logical intelligence. SCP-682 can engage you in conversation, but just talking to the creature calmly and cordially will sometimes cause it to enter its rage state, where it becomes even more dangerous and volatile. The beast is perpetually kept in a tank of powerful hydrochloric acid, melting its tissue to prevent it from reaching its full potential and going on a rampage. The creature's most terrifying asset, and the reason it's proven impossible to terminate thus far, is its incredible adaptability to any and all external stimuli. 682 is a reactive being, capable of not only surviving and regenerating from all attacks, but often incorporating those attacks into its own wide arsenal. In other words, if you're hoping to kill this thing, you better kill it on the first hit. Because if you don't, you better believe it's gonna hit you back 100 times harder. This brings us to the main event. some of the SCP Foundation's most ambitious and frightening attempts to terminate SCP-682, or even understand how it could theoretically be terminated. There are quite literally too many unsuccessful attempts for us to list them all here, so think of this as a highlight reel of the Foundation's most prominent failures. 682 was first cross-tested with SCP-017, a humanoid shadow entity shown to be able to consume matter with its shadows and leave no traces behind. Tests on tissue samples from 682 showed that SCP-017 was able to consume said tissues with no adverse effects. However, when SCP-017 was placed into the containment chamber with the actual creature, 682 let out a horrific roar that was so loud it damaged nearby audio equipment. SCP-017 fled to the corner of the room, and 682, in its rage state, attempted to breach containment. Agents managed to suppress and remove the creature, but no meaningful damage was logged. Attempt failed. SCP-173, the killer statue, was later brought in, hoping that its thus far impeccable track record for killing would hold strong. The second that 173 was introduced into the testing area, 682 retreated to the far wall and began screeching intensely. It was intelligent enough to know what it was dealing with here. While the researchers and guards expected an instantaneous reaction, there was actually a stalemate for over 6 hours, as 682 stared at 173 continuously. Eventually, the tie was broken when agents shot out 682's eyes with high-caliber sniper rifles, breaking the line of sight and causing 173 to attack. Though 682 sustained damage to several parts of its body, while its eyes regenerated, the creature was not killed. It then regenerated a number of eyes all over its body, covered in a clear armored carapace that made them resistant to bullets. The stalemate continued for an additional 12 hours as 682 maintained perpetual eye contact. 173 was eventually removed from the containment unit, and the mission was aborted. Attempt failed. In their desperation, the SCP Foundation restored to bringing in another dangerous and seemingly unkillable monster to take on 682. SCP-096, also known as the Shy Guy. As astute SCP fans will already know, this being kills anything that sees its face, with no known exceptions, and when it enters its attack mode, it's thought to be quite literally unstoppable. Or at least, it was. While SCP-096 was able to destroy 85% of 682's original body mass during their 27-hour battle, it was left mentally broken, wounded, and huddled in the corner. To this day, if ever confronted with SCP-682, the Shy Guy reacts in pure terror, turning away and clawing at its own face. Attempt failed. During a deadly containment breach, SCP-682 also went head-to-head organically with another iconic SCP Hall of Famer, SCP-106, also known as the Old Man. The Old Man and a shape-shifting psionic anomaly known as SCP-953 broke into 682's containment cell. The Old Man pulled both of his fellow anomalous combatants into his pocket dimension to continue the battle on his terms. However, despite losing 67% of his body mass during the ensuing pocket dimension showdown, 682 still prevailed, with the Old Man eventually fleeing back to his cell and 953 being collected and taken away by agents. Once again, SCP-682 continued to hold the title. But it wasn't just cross-testing experiments, intentional or otherwise. The SCP Foundation's quest to kill 682 led them to a number of more conventional murder methods, all with varying degrees of success. Due to SCP-682's highly adaptive abilities, some methods were discounted from the outset. For example, launching a powerful thermonuclear missile at the creature was soundly rejected by O5 Command, on the premise that if the creature wasn't destroyed and evolved to the point where it could shrug off nukes, humanity would be pretty much done for. Other ideas were abandoned just for being too ridiculous, such as one researcher's suggestion to fly the creature through the air and drop it from a considerable height, hoping to kill it with a high-altitude impact. I'm not sure we even need to tell you why that's a terrible idea, but during the experiments on SCP-682, the studies range from honest to incompetent to straight-up evil. One guest researcher fed 2 small innocent children to the creature just to see what would happen. He was then himself fed to the creature for his sadistic behavior, which was viewed as getting in the way of his professional conduct. After all, the Foundation is meant to be cold, not cruel. It was SCP-682 that had the monopoly on cruelty. Memetic kill agents were a resounding failure. They attempted to dismember 682 with a powerful laser, only to have the creature develop reflective surfaces that displaced the beam and caused catastrophic damage to the area around it.
They attempted to kill the creature by sucking all the air out of its containment facility and create a vacuum, but it expelled a dangerous gaseous compound that reacted violently and exploded when air was once again introduced into the room. The Foundation used high-precision blades to slice SCP-682 into approximately 12,000 pieces, then separated these pieces. Unsurprisingly, by this point, this attempt also failed. The 12,000 pieces reformed a short while later into the fully operational killing machine we all know and fear. In one particularly frightening display of intelligence and adaptability, the Foundation attempted to kill 682 with extreme heat, but it shielded itself by developing a second carapace composed of solid helium. When personnel entered the room following the failed attempt on the creature's life, it shattered its helium carapace into deadly shards that fired around the room and shredded all Foundation personnel in attendance. It had set a trap, and that trap had been wildly successful. The creature's ability to adapt to seemingly any offense is unparalleled, to the point where Foundation staff have no idea how to classify this creature, whether it's organic, inorganic, or even alive at all based on any definitions we could understand. At every turn, the creature just raised more questions. What is it? Is it possible to destroy it at all by any means? Who was even trying to kill who here? Because it certainly seemed like SCP-682 had a masterful KD ratio by now. More extreme feats of cross-testing continued in the Foundation's growing desperation to eliminate this monster. SCP-162, which is a hypnotic ball of sharp objects, hooks, and high-tension fishing line, was introduced to 682's containment cell. The hooks latched onto the creature and tore huge portions off, including its entire lower jaw and one of its limbs. However, 682 was still able to breach containment, kill 11 people, and badly wound 86 others. It regenerated its severe injuries in no time. The beast was even taken to the domain of the Gate Guardian, one of the proposals for SCP-001. The Guardian had a flaming sword hotter than the sun, capable of destroying its targets on an atomic level. Naturally, SCP-682 survived and regenerated. Perhaps the most fascinating cross-test of all was between 682 and SCP-053, who manifests as a kind, innocent little girl with the unfortunate condition of causing homicidal tendencies in all who come into contact with her for more than 10 minutes. The people with these tendencies would then attempt to harm the girl, but would immediately drop dead shortly after, leaving the girl intact. The researchers present anticipated two possible outcomes here. The optimistic outcome, in which 682 enters a rage state, attacks 053, and died for good, and the realistic outcome, in which 682 attacks 053, possibly experiencing some minor injury or nothing at all, and 053 had to be removed from the containment cell. But that didn't happen. What did occur was considerably more shocking than any kind of violence. When 053 entered 682's containment chamber, the monster became uncharacteristically docile. Researchers and staff were baffled and watched with amazement as 053 approached the terrifying, immortal, mass-murdering monster and began to play with it. 682 even allowed 053 to draw on its face with crayons. Researchers thought they must have been dreaming, seeing this surreal display play out. 053 even appeared to have affection for this unkillable misanthrope. It was a single act in defiance of everything they thought they knew. When Foundation personnel entered the containment cell to separate the two, 682 went ballistic and killed multiple guards. 053 also wept, sad at being separated from her new friend. To this day, despite further testing, the Foundation has no idea how or why this happened. Like many details surrounding SCP-682, it's shrouded in deeply frustrating mystery. And so the tale of SCP-682 continues, in spite of the Foundation's best efforts. The monster continues to breach containment and slaughter with some regularity, taking out its seemingly limitless hatred for not only human beings, but anything that dares draw breath. Nobody knows where exactly the creature is from, what its true nature is, or why its ability to adapt and regenerate far exceeds any known organism on this planet. Perhaps one day, through enough research and cross-testing, we can someday answer these questions with scientific precision. But until then, we only have one answer. Hatred never dies.
It's 3 a.m. and the facility is quiet. Office workers and administrators roam the halls. Security officers stand at their posts, clad in advanced tactical armor and carrying standard-issue M4 carbines. 3 Foundation employees sit at flickering monitors watching a live feed of footage from the containment cell of the infamous SCP-106, or as it's referred to by all staff, the Old Man. No Foundation personnel are permitted to travel within 60 feet of the cell for security reasons, and nobody is permitted to physically interact with the anomaly without the approval of 2/3 of O5 Command. The observer's eyes itch and sting from hours of unending blue light exposure, but they can't look away. The Old Man is crafty. He might have the insatiable bloodlust of a hungry great white shark, but he's not mindless. He's a calculating predator, more sadistic than the worst human serial killer, and he's always searching for the next opportunity. According to the Foundation records, he's been active since at least World War II, and it's estimated that he has hundreds if not thousands of victims to his name, and many of those made simple but extremely foolish mistakes of underestimating him. After all, it only takes a few seconds of inattentiveness and the briefest moment of distraction to give him the window he needs. To do what, you ask? Oh, don't worry, you'll find out, just like they did. The Old Man has his nickname for a reason. Most of the time, he really does look exactly like that, an old man, or more specifically an old man's decaying corpse, his body covered in rotten, dark, grayish-black flesh that looks like putrid meat. Though the creature has been observed being able to change shape, the rot seems to run too deep for the Old Man to ever hide it. Foundation employees that have observed SCP-106 for extended periods of time have reported seeing it assume the form of grinning, decayed children and women whose rotted flesh barely hangs on their creaking bones. Just seeing the images through a video feed is enough to cause a lifetime of insomnia and other sleeping issues. Still, they have a job to do and the cameras remain fixed on the Old Man. He's been completely motionless for 3 months, just sitting there like a Buddhist monk in deep meditation. A novice might see this period of inactivity as a cause for celebration, but those with experience know that this is merely the calm before the storm. SCP-106 can remain in a dormant state for months at a time. Described by the Foundation scientists as a lulling state, it's believed that the Old Man is simply waiting for its captors to get soft, make a mistake, or simply have a momentary lapse in concentration, which is all it needs to make its move. It had happened so many times before, and it was about to happen again. One of the observers must have felt an overwhelming wave of anxiety as he saw the creature ever so slightly twitch. Just a tiny quiver in the shoulder muscles, but that was enough to tell the observer that their day had just taken a terrifying turn. He grabbed the emergency phone fixed to his desk and practically screamed into the receiver that 106 is moving, that they need a tactical team stat. But it was already too late. He and the other 2 observers stared into the monitors with their mouths agape as a gooey, rust-like substance began to pool around the creature on the floor of its cell. Slowly, the creature craned its withered neck around. Its face was fixed into a broad, yellow-toothed, lipless grin. Its eyes had the kind of dull, flat malice of an underwater predator. It looked directly into the camera, directly at them, and smiled. The observers knew this was bad. Really, really bad. With what they could have sworn was a little nod, the Old Man began sinking into the rusty puddle it made on the ground beneath it, until it had disappeared entirely. SCP-106 is capable of phasing through any solid surface with ease, making it one of the hardest entities to reliably contain, and earning it a spot on the dreaded Keter class, reserved for the anomalies that are complete nightmares to keep locked up. Through the years of costly research and deadly trial and error, the Foundation would later devise ways of at least slowing the creature down. It's shown to have an aversion to lead, highly complex or random physical structures, and intense bright light. None of these cause harm to the creature, as far as we know, literally nothing can, but they'll at least buy you some precious extra seconds with which to at least try and escape. Seconds the 3 observers didn't have. One of them grabbed an emergency line again and barked into it that they had lost visual on the anomaly. Just then, the observers heard a faint crackling sound behind them and the hissing of a chemical burn. They turned in horror to see a huge rusty burn mark expanding across the wall, right next to the door, which was their only escape route. They backed as far away from the door as they could as a rotten hand began reaching out of the mass of corrosive black sludge, followed by the grinning face of SCP-106, ready to have some fun. Meanwhile, 2 heavily armed security officers, Agents Goodwin and Resnick, came charging down the corridor toward the observation rooms. It became a bleak slogan during SCP-106 escape attempts that all you need to do is follow the screams, and that motto was proven true that night because awful things were happening to the observation personnel. They were certainly screaming about it. Of course, even with the top-of-the-line firearms, there was little they could do to harm the rampaging old man. He seemed immune to all forms of physical damage. All they could hope to do was keep the thing distracted until the scientists and containment specialists finished the preparations to lure him back into his containment cell. Goodwin surged forward while Resnick covered his six. Vigilance was key, as unlike a standard human combatant, SCP-106 could attack from literally any angle, including above or below. Physical obstacles were irrelevant to him, and no cover was safe. The hardened security officers could see the burn mark on the wall of the observation room as they approached. SCP-106 was perpetually coated in a thick black mucus with powerful corrosive properties that left any surfaces it touched permanently marred. Foundation scientists speculated that this mucus served as a kind of pre-digestive substance that tenderizes meat and bone alike. But to what purpose this serves is a mystery, as the old man has never been observed eating. It's postulated that the only purpose is causing additional pain. Goodwin and Resnick knew to treat this hissing sludge as a potential threat, as the corrosive properties would remain active for as much as 6 hours before finally fizzling out. The two officers shared a quiet nod before Goodwin breached the observation room door with a hard kick. The two of them surged inside, guns at the ready. In their time working at the Foundation, they'd seen some truly horrific sights. From the mutilation of D-Class personnel, typically death row prison inmates brought in for use as SCP guinea pigs, to the violence and mayhem of a containment breach. But there was nothing in their past that would ever make the horrifying sight they saw in the observation room that night feel normal. All three observers were dead. Almost nothing remained of two of them, and the third, while still intact, no longer looked human. He looked like he'd somehow been dead 100 years in the brief period that the old man had been free. His skin was gray and completely dried out, and his mouth was locked into a perpetual scream. It was a massacre, but there was no sign of the old man. Goodwin grabbed his radio and whispered, "This is Goodwin in Observation Room 6, requesting immediate backup. We have no idea where this thing," but his sentence was cut off by a sudden scream from Agent Resnick. SCP Foundation security officers are as tough as nails, the best of the best, you might say, recruited from the top military organizations in the world. So hearing one of them scream in fright is a rare, if not impossible, occurrence. But even they were forced to yell out in fear when they looked up to see the old man standing on the ceiling, grinning down at them. Resnick raised his M4 and shot a 3-round burst at center mass. SCP-106 didn't care. Even under sustained gunfire from the two security officers, it didn't flinch. The old man simply reached down and snatched Agent Resnick from the ground like it was picking an apple from a tree. The old man held Resnick in one hand and pounded its other rotten fist into the agent's body, breaking all of his bones. Resnick screamed for his partner to help him, but there was no time. Before Goodwin could do anything, SCP-106 began receding back into another slimy burn mark on the wall. Only this time, he was taking his screaming victim with him. Agent Resnick gave one more horrified scream before he was pulled backward into the inky darkness, leaving the room silent except for the burning hiss of the corrosive goo left behind. You might think this would be the end of it, but no. For poor Agent Resnick, the worst was yet to come. He was being dragged into what the SCP Foundation scientists refer to as the Old Man's Pocket Dimension, a miniature layer of reality within our own where the malicious SCP is essentially a cruel, all-powerful god. According to witness reports extracted from victims who were taken to this little nightmare realm, the dimension resembles a series of twisting, endless corridors where the old man stalks and tortures his captured victims to the breaking point, manipulating space and time to his own sadistic ends. On rare occasions, the SCP will even release its victims just for the joy of hunting, capturing, and torturing them all over again. While Agent Resnick was learning the true meaning of terror, containment specialists were mobilizing in its cell, preparing the one known tried and true method of luring the old man back, tempting it with the prospect of causing even more suffering. In order to do this, Foundation personnel take one of the aforementioned Class D personnel and begin inducing extreme pain by breaking a major bone or slicing a tendon every 20 minutes. The victim's agonizing screams are then played over the facility's intercom, acting as bait for the pain-loving old man. The screams echo through the facility's otherwise silent halls as the mutilated corpse of Agent Resnick falls from a new scorch mark on the ceiling. The old man can hear the sounds of suffering ringing out through the air around him, and he can barely contain his excitement over the prospect of a new plaything. The snapped femurs, the torn Achilles tendons, it was all too good to miss. Having had its twisted fun with the security officers and observers, SCP-106 wandered back to its containment cell, where a new screaming victim awaited. The other security officers, containment specialists, and scientists evacuated the area, leaving the old man alone with his prey. While the unfortunate Class D was left to his fate, the rest of the staff commenced cleanup procedures, which mainly involve wiping the brown and black mucus from the walls. It would probably be at least another month before anything like this happened again, and new personnel would be transferred over to the facility to replace the fallen. All in all, just another night at the SCP Foundation.
Man, it's even better on the 15th read. Oh, hello, I didn't see you there, dear viewers of SCP Explained. I'm on break between supervising SCP-682 termination attempts and inspecting the mops we use on SCP-173's leavings, so I decided to do what all the cool people are doing in their spare time right now. Rereading Chainsaw Man, the hit manga by Japanese author and artist Tatsuki Fujimoto. For the uninitiated, it's the story of Denji, a poor young man from Japan who makes his living hunting devils, dangerous creatures that are embodiments of mankind's greatest fears. But when that living leads to him dying at the hands of a gang of zombie yakuza, believe me, it makes sense in context, he bonds with the legendary Chainsaw Devil and is reborn as Chainsaw Man, an unconventional superhero who chainsaws first and asks questions later. Naturally, I was eager to see how one of our own bloodthirsty killers would fare against Denji's chainsaws of fury, so I selected the most violent, battle-hardened, and carnage-hungry anomaly out there, SCP-076-2, the immortal warrior known as Abel. The two of them have a surprising amount of things in common. Both are effectively immortal and can revive after sustaining massive physical injuries. Both absolutely love to fight with their array of deadly weapons and anomalous strength. Both have been part of experimental operations groups, with Denji being a member of Japan's Public Safety Devil Hunters Division 4, and Abel being an ex-member of the SCP Foundation's disastrous Pandora's Box Mobile Task Force, most of which he later massacred out of boredom. You can probably see why these two really did feel like the perfect matchup. So after forcing the trusty Anomatron 6000 to read every currently available volume of Chainsaw Man and compute years of Abel's gruesome battle data, I've set up the perfect simulation for your viewing pleasure. And hey, fellow fans of the manga, isn't it horrifying that even we beat MAPPA to the punch of animating this thing? Ah, God, that joke will age poorly if that anime comes out before this. Anyway, let's crank this machine into action and let her rip. Japan, 1997. Everything is roasting in the July heat. Men in Black, Harrison Ford's Air Force One, and Air Bud are hitting theaters for the first time. Everything is right with the world. That's why over in the headquarters of the Public Safety Devil Hunting Department, Denji, our chainsaw-loving hero, is being praised by his kind boss and mentor figure, Makima, a lovable, supportive woman who will never do anything wrong. She even loves dogs. How could a person who loves dogs ever be evil? That very morning, Denji and his Chainsaw Man form manage to defeat the accidentally making a mistake on your tax forms and now you're going to prison devil, who had been terrorizing downtown Tokyo. It was a challenging battle, but in the end, he'd managed to turn the tables and defeat the creature by setting it on fire. Needless to say, Makima was extremely pleased with Denji's work here, but now she had considerably more graver news to impart. She'd gotten word from an envoy of another organization that hunts down dangerous and anomalous creatures, the SCP Foundation, that an extremely lethal entity had breached their containment and was now somewhere in Japan. The entity in question was not a devil, and thereby would be working on a different rule set. Makima opened a file faxed to her by the Foundation. Yes, remember, this is set in 1997, and gave Denji the crucial lowdown. Several hours ago, the entity known as Abel had resurrected from his huge black sarcophagus in the underwater chamber of the classified facility Containment Area 25B. After waking up, Abel had slaughtered his way through the entire base, killing every SCP Foundation operative in his path,
and then swimming out into the Pacific Ocean. Sometime after that, he infiltrated a Japanese cargo ship and murdered all the workers on board before steering the ship back towards the land of the rising sun, where he hoped to claim even more victims. Mikima told Denji that it would fall to him and his associates to stop this Abel, with a little help from the SCP Foundation's intelligence. But be warned, Abel is an incredible combatant with extreme physical strength and durability, as well as surprising tactical intelligence. It wouldn't be an easy fight, but Mikima promised that if Denji won, she'd hug him and go to a nearby karaoke bar with him. Denji replied, "Consider him dead already, Miss Mikima." Meanwhile, Abel was walking through the slums of Tokyo, marveling at the neon signs for bars and clubs. His journey to Japan hadn't been an accident. Abel had been to Japan once before, in the year 1605. He'd faced the legendary Japanese philosopher and swordsman Miyato Musashi, considered by many to be one of the greatest warriors in human history. Abel had dueled Musashi, who famously wielded 2 katanas at once, in the hills of the Harima province, where after a tense battle, Musashi cut him down. Abel would not resurrect again during Musashi's lifetime, but the battle gave him a deep and abiding respect for the legendary warrior. Abel knew that if the opportunity ever rose again, he would return to Japan in hopes of experiencing such a brilliant battle yet again. But the industrial and technological boom had changed so much. It was no longer the quiet and pastoral Japan he'd experienced, but a booming epicenter of trade and commerce. He found it all strange and perplexing. Suddenly, he found himself surrounded by a group of Japanese street thugs, many of them wielding switchblades. They laughed at his strange outfit, which to them looked like an old, worn bedsheet. One of the smarter members of the group had already decided to go home when the others made up their mind to mug Abel. The warrior's extensive tattoos made him look like a Middle Eastern Yakuza Don. The rest, however, were happy to take their chances with him. "Empty your pockets if that goofy toga even has pockets," the leader said, holding up his switchblade, "unless you want to get cut." Abel just smirked and drew a pair of long obsidian daggers. In the following moment, the alley was filled with screams, then was silent yet again. Abel walked on, breathing a sigh of disappointment at how incredibly mediocre this first fight had been, his blades dripping with fresh blood. Musashi is rolling in his grave, Abel thought to himself. Meanwhile, across town, Denji and the rest of Division 4 were mobilizing. It was him, the serious sword-wielding Aki, and the adorable, pathologically lying blood fiend, Power. They'd been told over the phone by a man named Dr. Bright that Abel would be relatively easy to track down. He's not known for his subtlety. All you need to do is follow the trail of carnage he causes wherever he goes. From the way he talks about him, it seems almost as though Dr. Bright bears a personal grudge against Abel. How strange. Power didn't seem intimidated. She proudly proclaimed,
"I don't think this battle will be difficult at all. In fact, I've faced this Abel before and defeated him handily."
Aki sighed and asked, "When did this happen?"
"Last Tuesday, of course,"
she replied. Power had only heard about Abel this morning, but Denji and Aki had learned better than to dispute her at this point. Suddenly, a large television screen that had been previously relaying an ad for a cutting-edge stereo system cut to an emergency news report. There had been a horrific incident in downtown Tokyo, where a bar had been attacked and most of its patrons murdered by a deranged tattooed man carrying a pair of huge swords. Aki immediately recognized this place. The bar was Yakuza-owned. If this Abel was on the hunt for worthy opponents, it makes all the sense in the world that Japan's iconic crime syndicates would be his first target. Denji, Aki, and Power knew exactly where they needed to go. Over at the bar, Abel was having a whale of a time. Innocent patrons were running and screaming, while the Yakuza engaged in an all-out war with a terrifying, inhuman warrior. Several of them had already been cut down. 2 Yakuza soldiers behind the bar were reloading illegal Uzis and preparing to return fire. Both were sweating, terrified by the sudden, random attack. When they'd shot him before, he'd managed to dodge most of the bullets and expertly blocked the rest with his swords. Who the hell had sent this monster? Was he with the Triads, the Russian mob, or some devil summoned by the Japanese government to crack down on them? Whatever the case, he seemed almost impossible to kill. The two men stood back up and opened fire. Abel held his two swords and spun like a propeller, blocking all the bullets almost effortlessly. He then produced another dagger, seemingly from thin air, and threw it directly into the heart of one of the two remaining Yakuza behind the bar. He dropped to the ground dead instantly, leaving only his friend alive in a bar full of corpses. That's when Abel noticed a decorative katana behind the bar. He smiled and ordered the surviving Yakuza soldier to pick up the sword and give him a real fight. The hapless mobster realized in that moment that this guy was truly crazy, whoever he was. But what choice did he have now? With terror in his heart, the last surviving Yakuza grabbed the katana and unsheathed it. "Good," Abel said, his voice deep and menacing. "Now, come fight me. Let's see if you last a few seconds longer than your worthless friends, shall we?" He did not. The second the Yakuza ran towards Abel, and the ancient swordsman swiped at him with one of his blades, cutting through the katana and the opponent holding it. A puny gangster never stood a chance against a deadly immortal warrior, and Abel was furious. The last time he was here, he faced a truly expert killer, who even managed to end Abel's life in a single combat. And now he was slaying insects in a karaoke bar. Pathetic. Suddenly, his ears pricked up. He turned to see a red axe flying at his head at incredible speeds. With his superhuman reflexes, he managed to dodge just in time, but the axe still cleaved off a chunk of his hair as it passed. Abel could see the one who threw it standing at the entrance to the bar. It was the blood fiend, Power, who'd made the axe out of her own blood. Standing next to her were Denji and Aki, Denji wielding an axe and Aki stoically observing. "Damn, Miss Makima promised we do karaoke at this bar if I beat you," Denji said. "You're going down for this." Abel smiled and pulled out another pair of blades. "Finally," he roared. "Warriors who fight the old-fashioned way. I feared the years had stolen you all from me." Power stepped forward, producing another blood axe from nowhere. She yelled,
"Tremble in fear, Abel. 'Tis I, your arch-nemesis, the mighty Power!"
Abel had literally never seen her before in his thousands of years of life, but he appreciated that these warriors were at least able to match his level of drama. As far as he was concerned, the fight was on. But even Abel didn't know the level of fighting he was getting in for here. As he charged forward, the trio split, immediately surrounding him. Good tactics, Abel thought to himself. Already, this was promising. Aki, who had remained quiet up to this point, attacked first. He drew a tatano knife from his suit jacket and slashed at Abel with impressive speed. But unlike three of the other combatants in this situation, Aki was only human, which gave him a serious disadvantage. Abel decided it would be best to put him out of commission first. With a quick and brutal kick to the chest, Aki was thrown against the wall with the majority of his ribs broken. Revved up by his own bloodlust, Abel turned to Denji in Power and grinned like a maniac. This was already the most fun he'd had in a long time. Who are these people? Doesn't matter, he thought. They'll be dead soon anyway. While Abel was still locked in thought, Power pulled out a comically large hammer made out of her own blood and brought it down towards Abel. He was surprised by the sudden attack. Did this girl have the same weapon-producing powers as him? This just keeps getting more interesting.
"'Tis the end, Abel!"
Power screamed as the hammer came down.
"You have once again been defeated by the mighty Power!"
Again, just to clarify, these two had never met each other. But it was already too late. Abel punched upwards, his clenched fist colliding with the hammer. He hit it with such terrifying force that Power's blood hammer shattered against his knuckles. In that same instant, Abel noticed Denji running at him with an axe from behind. Abel produced another obsidian dagger and threw it into Denji's forehead, dropping him to the ground immediately. Pathetic. Power tried to produce another weapon, but she used up too much blood already. Before she had a chance to make anything substantial, Abel sprung forwards with terrifying speed, trying to land a killing blow. But even weakened, Power was freakishly fast. She was able to dodge his blow and kick him in the ribs, momentarily stunning him. Of course, she took the time to gloat, putting her hands on her hips and laughing victoriously.
"Need a second to catch your breath, Abel? It is to be expected. None can keep up with me,"
she grandiosely announced.
"Perhaps you should just give up and agree to become my servant. I might even teach you a thing or two about fighting.
Suddenly, Abel was standing right in front of her, squeezing her throat with his iron grip. He smiled, flashing teeth, and said, "If you want to kill, kill. Don't talk." With a surprisingly minimal amount of strength, he squeezed and heard a crunch from Power's neck. He dropped her limp body to the ground. Lucky for Power, Abel wasn't aware that a fiend like Power can survive an injury like this as long as she's fed some more blood. Instead, he just sighed in disappointment.
Is that all you weaklings have to offer?
He bellowed. Aki, barely conscious after being kicked against the wall, remained just conscious enough to activate his contract with a powerful beast known as the Fox Devil. He twists his hands into a strange gesture and whispers the word, "Come," before falling unconscious, but that's still enough. Suddenly, a gigantic demonic fox claw burst through the wall of the bar, spraying dust and rubble everywhere. Abel was definitely not expecting that. He dodged several times as the claw swiped for him, often barely missing him. For its last strike, it lunged forward and raked 4 claw marks across his chest. Abel was shocked by the sudden pain. It felt fantastic. He pulled a long obsidian spear out of one of his pocket dimensions and forced it down through the Fox Devil's paw and into the ground, pinning it in place. After a moment of thrashing, the claw dissipated into smoke, lending Abel another victory, though even he would admit this was a more exciting fight than the other ones had been. Was that it? Had he gained total victory once more, just like he so often did these days? He was about to take pity on himself when Denji rose up behind him. "How about a rematch?" Denji asked. Abel grinned. He liked this kid. "Challenge me, child," Abel said. "Well, since you asked," Denji smirked. Denji reached into his shirt and grabbed the ripcord emerging from his chest. It was time to go into overdrive on this thing. He gave it a mighty yank, and like the rev of a chainsaw, the madness began. Denji transformed, giant blades emerging from his arms, and his head transformed into a toothy saw blade nightmare. He gave a mechanical roar that spewed smoke. This wasn't just Denji anymore. This was Chainsaw Man. Now this, Abel thought, feeling his adrenaline spike, is more like it. Following Denji's lead, Abel reached into one of his pocket dimensions and pulled out one of his favorite weapons, one he'd only previously used against the mighty hard-to-destroy Reptile SCP-682, the Chainsaw Claymore. A huge two-handed sword with the eternally twisting, shredding teeth of a chainsaw ever circulating around it. It was time for Chainsaw versus Chainsaw.
What the hell are you waiting for?
Chainsaw Man roared.
Are we gonna stand around all day or are we gonna fight?
Abel couldn't have said it better himself. The two charged at one another at lightning speeds, chainsaw clashing against chainsword. The sheer force of the contact was enough to send a shockwave blasting through the bar. It rapidly became a power struggle, each of them trying hard to force their chainsaws out of the stalemate. Realizing that this time he perhaps couldn't win with raw strength, Abel backflipped away to reassess his options. But Chainsaw Man had no intention of giving Abel time to think about it. He darted towards Abel with the weight and momentum of a runaway freight train. If Abel hadn't raised his claymore to parry, he would have been shredded to pieces by the devil's saws in an instant. Instead, the two of them rocketed out of the nearby wall in a cascade of debris, causing everyone on the outside street to run for their lives. The two quickly stood from the stumble. The two quickly stood up, catching their breath.
"Impressive," Abel said. "You're much better than the others."
Instead of replying, Denji briefly retracted his armed chainsaws and grabbed a nearby parked car, throwing it directly at Abel. Abel reacted quickly, cleaving the car in half with his claymore and charging for Chainsaw Man again. Just before Abel could land a lethal strike, Chainsaw Man deployed his chainsaws again, blocking the blow. Abel sped around him trying to strike again and again, but Chainsaw Man blocked every strike with stunning efficacy. Abel was astonished. Few had ever been able to go toe-to-toe with him like this before. He could feel his heart pounding gloriously in his chest. He would give Denji a warrior's death. With a furious yell, Abel brought down the Chainsaw Claymore for a devastating vertical strike, but Chainsaw Man was ready. He arranged his armed chainsaws in a cross formation like a giant pair of scissors and caught Abel's chainsword between them. Chainsaw Man pulled his arms in opposite directions, slicing Abel's mighty sword in half. The immortal swordsman skidded backwards to avoid the fallout. producing 2 smaller blades immediately. This Chainsaw Man just kept exceeding expectations, didn't he? Abel would need to change tactics if he wanted to win this one. Chainsaw Man was impressed by the speed and tenacity of his foe. For someone who apparently wasn't even a devil, Abel sure packed a hell of a punch. Did he ever run out of those damned weapons? As though attempting to answer Chainsaw Man's question for him, Abel began running around his flank, rapidly producing and throwing blades and axes in a startling volley. Chainsaw Man was able to use his chainsaw arms and face to block most of them, but not all of them. Several daggers and small throwing axes splattered into the tender flesh of Chainsaw Man's chest. Abel had successfully wounded him, and he wasn't done. Feeling a little more confident now, Abel decided to take a different tactic. He produced a large spiked mace from thin air and ran at Chainsaw Man while the devil was still recovering from his projectile attack. With one brutal whack, he sent Denji flying down the street, carving a rut into the concrete beneath him. But Abel wasn't done. While Chainsaw Man was still trying to recover, Abel leaped onto him and began beating him into the ground with his mace. The strikes were so brutal, they shook the earth and sent cracks across the surrounding ground. Then, Abel stopped. He realized for a moment that he was letting his bloodlust get the better of him. This was dishonorable. Where would be the fun in beating this boy to death while he lay on the ground and depriving himself of one of the greatest opponents he's had in quite some time? No, that would not do at all. He'd give him one more chance. "On your feet, boy," Abel said. "You fight well. Get up and carry on. I won't let a beast as rare as you die like a common dog. Rise and fight me." And Chainsaw Man did as he was told. Abel was shocked to see the very ground shatter underneath him as Chainsaw Man burst up through it, all his swords at the ready. The mace was thrown from Abel's hands as Chainsaw Man launched up towards him, all metal teeth and fury. Luckily for Abel, he pulled out a battle axe just in time to block the flurry of brutal strikes from the patron saint of chainsaws. Now this was a fight even Musashi would be proud of. "Yes, boy, yes!" Abel yelled. "This is true combat." Chainsaw Man replied with the swing of his blades, which Abel was narrowly able to dodge. The two finally landed back down on the ground, and Abel was fast enough to bury his battle axe in Chainsaw Man's shoulder. Before the devil could return a blow to Abel, the anomalous swordsman pulled out a pair of his favorite swords and locked Chainsaw Man's arms in place. Chainsaw Man was undeniably incredibly powerful, but it looked like Abel's superior experience and tactics might save him this time. "What the hell are you?" Chainsaw Man roared. "You've been a worthy opponent, boy. Those are few and far between," Abel said. "I'll remember you for this." But before Abel could execute a killing blow, he felt a blood-red throwing axe stick into his back. Abel winced in pain to see Power and Aki about 30 feet behind him. Power was propping Aki up. He donated some of his blood to bring her back to life, and she was just as delusionally cocky as ever. Abel was about to say something, but he already made a fatal mistake, letting his guard down. Before another word could pass the cursed warrior's lips, one of Chainsaw Man's armed chainsaws passed directly through his heart, tearing it apart within Abel's chest. It was a sudden and decisive killing blow. Chainsaw Man pulled his saw back out of Abel's chest, stained with the deadly anomaly's blood. Abel collapsed to the ground, wheezing and bleeding profusely from the hole in his chest. But strangely, as Power, Aki, and Chainsaw Man converged around him, they realized he was smiling. "Thank you," Abel said, and died yet again. With the battle won, like an incredible Hulk made of metal, Chainsaw Man transformed back into Denji. The trio stood around Abel's corpse, deeply confused as to what had just happened. If this was the kind of thing the SCP Foundation normally dealt with, they all silently agreed that perhaps it would be better not to get involved with them in the future. Except Power, of course, who said,
"You two should be thanking me for defeating him. You both owe me drinks for this."
Hundreds of miles away in a black sarcophagus deep underwater, surrounded by professional SCP Foundation divers, Abel's body once again returned. Who knows how long he'd remained sleeping in there. But what we do know is that his deathless sleep was suffused with the sweet dreams, knowing that this world still held worthy opponents, and for Abel, that was everything. On a cold October night in 2003, Shirley Yates of Seattle, Washington was just about to get ready for bed when she heard a knock at the door. She approached the door and asked the person on the other side to identify themselves.
The voice outside responded immediately. It was a salesman who just wanted a few moments of Mrs. Yates' time. This was odd for two reasons. First, it was almost 10 o'clock at night, much later than is usual for door-to-door salesmen. And second, the knock hadn't come from Mrs. Yates's front door. It was coming from the door to her bathroom. Has your home ever been visited by a door-to-door salesman? If you were born in the last 40 years, then your answer to that question is probably no. In the age of online shopping, the idea of a salesperson going from house to house hawking vacuum cleaners or encyclopedia sets feels like a relic from the past. It's highly unlikely you'd ever see one walking the streets nowadays, and equally unlikely that one would knock on your front door. However, if you live in Washington state, you might need to be wary of a certain salesman who is still doing the rounds. SCP-1879, also known as the Indoor Salesman and the Doorman, is a phenomenon that manifests randomly in homes throughout Washington. Subjects will hear persistent knocking from the interior doors of their homes, and the affected door becomes classified as SCP-1879-1. The knocking doesn't stop until the door is opened, at which point the subject will be greeted by SCP-1879-2, a Caucasian man of indeterminate age standing around 170 centimeters tall. The man will claim to be a salesman and immediately try to pitch a bizarre product to the subject whose home he's just invaded. The SCP Foundation was first alerted to the existence of the indoor salesman when they had intercepted a 911 call coming from the home of Mrs. Shirley Yates. She had opened the door to her bathroom in an attempt to get the salesman to stop knocking, and once he was in her home, he refused to leave. According to Yates, he kept disappearing in and out of random doors in her house. Foundation Field Agent Rogers was equipped with a recording device and sent in to investigate the case with several other agents. When he arrived at the home, he found Mrs. Yates inconsolable. SCP-1879-2 was still rapidly talking at her, and strangely enough, the product he was holding and trying to sell to her was a Border Collie puppy. As soon as Agent Rogers entered the room, the man shifted his attention away from Mrs. Yates and towards him. He then started trying to sell the puppy to Agent Rogers. Agent Rogers did not want to purchase this puppy, but he found that the man spoke so quickly and urgently, he couldn't get a word in edgewise. The man was begging Rogers to take the puppy, practically shoving it in his face, saying that he didn't need any money, and that the only payment he needed would be some of your time. Rogers grew so annoyed at being talked over and interrupted that he ordered the other field agents to apprehend the indoor salesman. They did so, but as soon as the agents walked him out of the front door of the house, he disappeared without a trace. The agents remained in the area to monitor the situation. SCP-1879-2 manifested again in Mrs. Yates's home 6 hours later, still trying to trade the puppy for no money, just a little of her time, 12 years to be precise. After hours and hours of being worn down by this supernaturally pushy salesman, Yates relented and agreed to take the puppy, and immediately disappeared. The indoor salesman then disappeared himself through the closet door before he could be apprehended again. At a loss for what to do, the agents administered Class A amnestics to Mrs. Yates's family and left. The reason for her disappearance wasn't fully known until 12 years later in 2015, when she reappeared in the same spot she disappeared from, having no concept of how much time had passed. The puppy really had just cost her 12 years of her life. Stories like that of Shirley Yates have popped up all over the state in the years since, from Everett to Walla Walla and everywhere in between. Due to the random nature of SCP-1879 events and the way the indoor salesman can disappear instantly in and out of any door in a building, the SCP Foundation has been unable to capture him. The best they've been able to do is monitor 911 calls from across the state, listening for keywords that might indicate another SCP-1879 infestation. When such an event is reported, the Foundation deploys Mobile Task Force Row 4, aka Shoes Salesman. This task force's entire purpose is to minimize the amount of harm the indoor salesman is able to cause by intercepting him before he can make a sale. This is a very important task, as evidenced by the story of Mrs. Yates, since while the products this salesman sells might be innocent, he doesn't accept payment in any normal currency. The price he asks for his products are always bizarre and often deadly. If all someone loses is 12 years of their life, they could be considered to be getting off easy. In one instance, the product being sold was a single red rose in exchange for the subject's heart. Once the deal was sealed, the subject dropped dead on the spot, with an autopsy revealing that his heart and circulatory system vanished from inside his body. In another, the indoor salesman offered 220 bananas and told the subject to simply give him some sugar. The subject agreed, and all candied goods in the home disappeared. In a third, the indoor salesman was trying to sell a thermonuclear warhead, the price of which was the subject's soul. The subject accepted, and at first nothing seemed to have happened. The Foundation confiscated the warhead and placed it into non-anomalous containment. Later that day, the subject went to listen to some music, only to find that 2 of her vinyl records had gone missing: Lady Soul and Almighty Fire by world-famous soul singer Aretha Franklin. So, even though he's incredibly invasive, annoying, and his transactions can be deadly, the indoor salesman still maintains a sense of humor. The fact that the Foundation can't capture the indoor salesman means that a lot of questions about him remain unanswered. The biggest by far is why he does what he does. In most SCP-1879 events, the indoor salesman seems frantic and desperate to make a sale. Often he will refer to having quotas and deadlines to meet, which implies some other unseen entity that he has to answer to. These questions remain unanswered because all attempts to interrogate the indoor salesman have been unsuccessful. When he manifests in a location, it's impossible to get him to stray from a sales pitch, and he disappears as soon as he successfully sells his wares. However, there was one instance where, after an SCP-1879 event took place, Foundation agents were there to witness a rare interaction between the indoor salesman and his mysterious employers. Agent Rogers and the rest of the shoes salesmen were called out to a home in Spokane, where rapid knocking had begun to emanate from the bedroom door. Equipped with recording devices, Rogers was able to record the voice of the indoor salesman coming from inside the bedroom. In the recording, the salesman grumbled to himself about not being able to meet his quota by tomorrow, saying that if he didn't, he'd be stuck in this world for the next century. He started knocking again, yelling through the door that he knew they were home. He kept knocking until he was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. The indoor salesman was heard picking it up, and Rogers managed to record the conversation. The person calling was, apparently, the indoor salesman's boss, who was calling to complain about his performance. Only one side of the conversation was heard, but evidently the indoor salesman's boss wasn't too happy about receiving 2 Aretha Franklin albums as payment instead of an actual human soul. The indoor salesman apologized for the joke, then told his boss, "It won't happen again, please don't hurt it. I'll meet the quota this time, I swear." He hung up, grumbling to himself again, "I better get to move up to at least accounting this time. I've paid my dues and then some." Rogers finally opened the door to the apparent disappointment of the indoor salesman, who was hoping to speak with the home's owner and was quite annoyed at having another one of his sales interrupted by MTF Row 4. Rogers tried to ask the indoor salesman who he'd just been speaking to on the phone, but as usual, the salesman started talking over him. "Now see here, let's think logically," he said. "You know I'm not going to tell you anything. I know you're not likely to buy what I'm selling. So let's just move on to greener pastures. I'm coming up close to a deadline, and I'm sure you're swamped with making sure good people don't lose their jobs, so I'll just be on my way and let you do that. Ciao." The indoor salesman tried to close the door, but Agent Rogers blocked it with his arm. He was tired of this SCP giving him the runaround, and he was going to keep the indoor salesman here if it was the last thing he did. He demanded the entity stay and be interviewed, and other members of the task force apprehended the salesman, making sure he couldn't leave the room. The indoor salesman, now held in place by several armed men, seemed to finally relent. He told Rogers, "I'm busy, so I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you something, no money out of your pocket, and we'll call it even. Sound good?" Rogers, just wanting to get this whole thing over with, agreed to those terms. 3 seconds later, every agent on the scene was dead, and the indoor salesman was able to straighten his tie, pick up his briefcase, and walk through the door to the bathroom. When the bodies of Agent Rogers and the rest of the MTF Row 4 were examined by Foundation scientists, the cause of death was found to be, in every case, thousands of coins suddenly appearing in not only their pockets, but also inside their stomachs, lungs, and even under their skin. Later that day, the indoor salesman was reported at a home in the same neighborhood. He was seen trying to sell the house's owner, 80-year-old retiree Alan Johnson, a Glock 18 pistol in exchange for his attention. As he had done so many times before, the indoor salesman disappeared through another door before the Foundation was able to reach the scene. And when the SCP arrived, they found Mr. Johnson still alive, but now missing his prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls attention. It's likely that, because of the nature of the entity, SCP-1879 might be entirely impossible to contain. The Foundation might never find out anything more than what they already know about the indoor salesman, the way he's able to manifest behind closed doors, or the reason he has to keep filling quotas for an unseen boss who apparently doesn't have a very good sense of humor. So, if you're ever in Washington State, be careful who you open your doors to, especially if the knocking you hear is coming from inside your house.
In a remote part of Russia, a mysterious disease outbreak was tearing through a tiny farming village with terrifying side effects. There was no cure, no clue to where it came from, and worst of all, the disease's terrifying impact didn't end with death. No, it was after those carrying the disease died that the real horrors started. After an agonizing fever that leaves the victims writhing in pain, they quickly succumb to the disease, only to rise from their graves to wreak havoc on the living. The virus continues to spread until the corpses outnumber those trying to hide from them, as the world spirals into almost certain ruin. It sounds like the plot of a zombie movie, but for the SCP Foundation, this is anything but fiction. And the terror that unfolded in that little Siberian town is the first recorded encounter with SCP-610, also known as the Flesh That Hates. First, livestock began to vanish from farms. Theft or wild animals were suspected, but no suspects could be found, and no mutilated remains turned up. The animals weren't being stolen, and they weren't being eaten, so what happened to them? With no more animals left to lose, the farmers themselves then began to disappear. But the authorities refused to take the missing persons cases seriously. The missing farmers' families would contact the police, make a report, and then the whole thing was forgotten. It was written off just as another unsolved disappearance, which wasn't uncommon in the wild and unforgiving region. Then, the police themselves began to disappear. The families of the missing farmers would sometimes report strange sounds from the surrounding woods, describing moans and inhuman screeches of pain. One young boy reported seeing a cow with what he described as tentacles lurking around the edge of the trees. Regional police were dispatched to the location and ordered to investigate and report back on their findings within 24 hours. But the units sent to the area didn't report back and were never heard from again. Upon learning of the reports, the Russian government grew increasingly concerned, fearing domestic insurgency or foreign espionage of some kind could be at play. They sent a small team of special agents to the area, and one by one, those agents disappeared, just like the others before them. It seemed no one who went into the village after the disappearances started ever came out again. They had all simply vanished. Desperate for answers, the Russian government contacted the only people in the world who could help: the SCP Foundation. What the Foundation found over the course of their investigation would shock and unnerve them, going beyond anything they had previously discovered. Before the investigation officially began, the affected area was sealed off by the Russian government. Not knowing if it would be safe to send researchers into the containment perimeter, the Foundation set up a small camera-mounted unit, nicknamed Herbie, to capture footage of whatever remained of the village. The images captured by Herbie revealed what exactly had become of the people in this doomed village, and the true nightmarish nature of SCP-610. SCP-610 is a Keter-class entity, meaning it's an anomaly that's exceedingly difficult to contain consistently or reliably, with containment procedures often being extensive and complex. 610 is a highly contagious skin disease that initially manifests like an ordinary allergic reaction, with symptoms including increased sensitivity, itching, and a rash. But within just 3 hours of those initial symptoms appearing, the rash starts to turn into masses of scar tissue on the chest and arms. These masses spread over the legs and back of the victim and completely consume them in thick, rubbery flesh within 5 hours. Once they're covered, the victim will cease all vital functions. Unfortunately for them, and doubly so for those around them, they do not stay dead. About 3 minutes after expiring,
the victim's vitals will restart at a heightened rate, and the masses of flesh encasing their body will begin to move and multiply, mutating them into a form beyond anything resembling the human they once were. The specific type of mutation varies from case to case, but has included the head becoming massive and bulbous, the growth of extra limbs, and, in especially gruesome cases, the victim's body splitting apart to allow extra tendrils of flesh to sprout from the open wound. Occasionally, an infected person will stop moving and become rooted to the ground in a set location. Once it is settled, their flesh will spread itself across the ground, encasing all nearby objects in flaps of scar tissue. The infected that maintain their mobility are highly aggressive, even violent, and will attempt to infect any living thing that comes into their line of sight. The disease does not only infect humans, and can take over any living organism within a matter of hours. Due to the highly contagious and dangerous nature of the disease, safe observation of infected specimens and areas is only possible with drones and mounted cameras. This brings us back to Herbie, the first such mounted camera to record footage of the infected area. Herbie was deployed to an infection site, also known as Site A, without any damage. It remained at the outside perimeter of the village for 2 hours, observing several infected humans and fire damage to many of the homes, before following an infected into an intact house. Herbie's camera feed captured the infected person entering the house and sitting down at the table inside. There were several other infected humans in the house, and one unidentified infected creature that remained immobile under the table. After viciously assaulting one of the other infected humans, the infected returned to the table and began to lay out plates on top of it. Pieces of its flesh began to wriggle and tear away from its body, before settling onto each plate. Once the plates were filled, the infected sitting at the table began to grab at the flesh and crush it into their mouths, in a perverse imitation of a normal mealtime gathering. After capturing this stomach-churning display, Herbie left the house and continued to explore the village. He recorded footage of a large stack of bodies that seemed to be made up of both Russian military and civilians, with an infected sitting on top. As Herbie maneuvered towards the remains of the town hall, an infected grabbed the rover off the ground. Herbie's camera was able to capture the face of the infected that grabbed the rover. The face was that of a young girl, around 10 years old, strangely intact atop a large, distorted body. The final moments of Herbie's camera feed captured the infected girl's face bursting open, revealing tendrils of flesh that pulled Herbie into the gaping maw. Then, the feed cut to black. Herbie was regarded as lost, but the video feed briefly resumed 5 hours later, showing the camera covered with an unidentified slime. After this, the video feed was cut for good, and Herbie abandoned in Site A. The Foundation has sent several manned expeditions into Site A, where many expedition forces have fallen victim to the infected. Several operatives were also lost in an earthquake that revealed a network of underground tunnels. A manned expedition into these tunnels was attempted, and the video feed that was captured by the researchers on the expedition was deeply disturbing. There were images of an abandoned church filled with infected, and a mass of uninfected or partially infected human captives. The final moments of the video feed from this expedition captured several operatives being murdered by an infected human wielding a farming scythe, indicating that the infected are capable of using simple weaponry in addition to brute force. The use of this weapon, paired with the presence of captives in the underground tunnels, paints a terrifying picture of the kind of organization the infected are capable of. No more manned expeditions have been attempted, or if they have been highly classified. Ordinarily, once a new SCP is discovered, it is placed in containment at the Foundation, with special procedures in place so that it can be studied or even neutralized in the rare occasions where it's deemed necessary. When it comes to SCP-610 though, containment might just be impossible. It simply covers too much area and is too dangerous to expose to human researchers. Instead, all infected areas have been isolated with the permission of the Russian government. There is an official perimeter established around these areas, and any civilians that approach them are told to leave under the pretense of ongoing military operations. For once, a top-secret military project is the more innocent answer. Armed guards are placed at the perimeter of every infected area, and any living thing with symptoms of SCP-610 spotted near the perimeter is to be immobilized, killed, and burned from as far away as possible. Any living thing that comes in contact with SCP-610, whether a soldier, a scientist, or a civilian, is immediately terminated, and their remains destroyed. If someone comes within 3 meters of an infected organism, they will be quarantined and remotely examined to determine if they have been infected. While the spread of SCP-610 can be airborne, it has been determined to be far less contagious when spread through air particles as opposed to physical contact. The infection sites remain active to this day, like modern-day leper colonies, though they are isolated from the general population, and the military is doing everything in their power to contain the infected. SCP-610 is still very much alive. It is rare for an entity to exist that the Foundation cannot truly contain, but can only try to guard against, and that makes this infection all the more terrifying. Who knows how much it has mutated over the years, growing, spreading, hungry for new hosts. There is still so much that the Foundation does not know about the flesh that hates, such as how it works, what it can do, or even where it came from, since the origin of the first infection is still, at this point, entirely unknown. It has shown itself to be capable of learning, planning, and protecting itself, so who is to say that it couldn't figure out a way to escape from its isolated area? It is so highly contagious and spreads so quickly that just one tiny infected rabbit and one inattentive soldier could be enough for SCP-610 to reach the general population. If it did, its violent, destructive nature and hatred for all life would mean that everything, not just the people, but animals, plants, and the world itself, could be at risk. And no one is ready for this kind of infection, a disease that turns the human body against itself, turns our skin into a weapon and a tomb, stripping away identity, humanity, and everything that isn't made of the same hateful flesh. So let's hope that the perimeter holds. And the next time you feel a little itchy, try not to think about what might happen next. What would you trade in order to make your deepest desires a reality? How much would you be willing to barter in order to have what you want? Whether it's money, love, fame, or power that you crave, would you bargain your soul to have it? How about your memories? What about the life of another person? If these questions intrigue you, then boy, do we have the deal of a lifetime for you. Well, not us, but rather a certain anomaly who's very, very interested in the art of the deal. We've all heard the old adage of a deal with the devil, meaning a pact with someone potentially shady in order to get what you want. Not only are you compromising your own principles when you make a deal like this, you're also running the risk of that deal coming back to haunt you when it's time to pay the devil his dues. And believe us, the devil always comes to collect. Of course, you've never made a deal with the actual devil, and if you had, it's likely you wouldn't live long enough to warn people not to make the same mistake. But we've all heard the legends, Beelzebub appearing to those in dire need of help and offering them salvation. Shaking that outstretched, clawed hand normally results in the desperate person getting what they need, but also agreeing to give Satan something along the lines of their soul or firstborn child, or sometimes something even worse. The point being that dealing with the devil often extracts a heavy price, and one you might not be so willing to pay if you could see the terms more clearly. Which brings us to SCP-738. Also known as the Devil's Deal. Although this SCP has no relation to the actual biblical Lord of Darkness himself, as far as we know anyway, that nickname should paint a very clear picture for you of how this entity operates. Kept in 3 linked containment chambers, SCP-738 is guarded at all times by armed Foundation personnel when not in use. Strangely for an anomaly with such a terrifying reputation, it appears as an elegant 3-piece set of furniture, the kind you might find in a fancy office belonging to a slick CEO. The set consists of a desk, one straight-back chair, and another more extravagant office chair, styled to look like a throne, all featuring brass detailing and exquisite velvet padding in a deep royal purple. When kept apart, these objects seem to be little more than just expensive pieces of office furniture, examples of quality craftsmanship that would likely cost you an arm and a leg to afford, but nothing overtly sinister or anomalous. Until that is, the 3 pieces are put together and you take a seat. If someone sits down opposite the throne, within the desk between them, then they had best be ready to bargain, because once you sit down, you will find yourself faced with an anomalous entity across from you on the throne.
While many of the D classes the Foundation has placed before this entity have described it as being charming or even seductive, descriptions of the entity's appearance varies wildly between subjects. In fact, it would seem that the entity deliberately appears differently to everyone that sees it, their very own personalized devil with which to strike a deal. After all, this business is personal. Additionally, the entity cannot be observed by anyone except for those sitting in the anomalous chair of SCP-738. For anyone not sitting in the special chair, the most they'll see of the entity is the throne shifting as it leans backwards or sits up. It isn't interested in being seen by anyone who isn't part of the transaction. This entity is clearly quite the negotiator and doesn't waste any time in getting to the meat of the conversation. During tests by the Foundation, recordings have been made of the entity's voice, making all manner of enticing offers and promises to whomever is sitting before it. The entity will produce parchment from the desk, writing up what looks to be a contract with a quill and ink pot. If whomever is sitting in the opposite chair makes a formal request to the entity, it will cease its previous barrage of offers and take a brief pause before suggesting a price. During their first attempt to gauge the nature and effects of SCP-738, the Foundation sent one of its researchers into a room containing the desk, throne, and chair. According to his report, he saw a man sitting behind the desk, wearing a sharp red and gold colored business suit. The entity immediately bombarded the man with potential deals they could strike, offering him greater recognition and respect for his research, the love of the woman the man wanted, and even offering him the chance to join the O5 Council. Refusing to be coerced into any of these deals, the researcher left the room and seemed to suffer no adverse effects for his refusal. Since this initial incident, when testing the behavior and effects of SCP-738, the Foundation primarily uses D-Class personnel. As we all know by now, these personnel are considered disposable, having been recruited from prisons around the world, and ones testing SCP-738 are fitted with an explosive collar, just in case. In one instance, one of these Class D personnel placed before the SCP-738 entity reported that this time, it had taken on the appearance of a beautiful, seductive woman. During the initial proposals made by the SCP-738 entity, the inmate was offered his freedom. The price of freedom is often high, but the Class D may not have been expecting the price to be the death of his best friend. But the inmate agreed to the terms of the deal he'd been offered and vanished shortly after. 5 hours later, though, he was recaptured by Foundation personnel. When another member of Class D personnel, a non-native English speaker, sat down to bargain with SCP-738, the entity communicated with him in his first language. Their deal, while similar to the previous test, used more specific wording. The Class D inmate asked for the power to never be held in a cell again, rather than just for freedom. The price asked for by the SCP-738 entity this time was every memory of the man's mother. After he accepted, an incident broke out which resulted in the inmate's death, as well as that of 12 Foundation guards. The next test the Foundation conducted into the effects of SCP-738 involved yet another Class D, this time utilizing an inmate with dyslexia and a mental disability, who reported that the entity appeared to take the form of a large pink rabbit. Once again adapting to the subject before it, the entity drew crude pictograms on its parchment, trying to convey a deal to the latest Class D to sit across the desk from it. There were a few words scattered about the page in English, but mostly unrelated insults aimed at the inmate's intelligence, or questioning the man's understanding of the deal the entity was proposing. The entity offered the man a sloppy Joe, stating the price to be Mopsy, the name given to a toy that the inmate had smuggled into the Foundation and been allowed to keep. Upon accepting the deal, a fine china plate appeared in front of the man, with the promised sandwich upon it. The man quickly finished the food that the entity had provided, only to become distressed when he realized that Mopsy had vanished. Shortly after the test had concluded, Foundation staff issued the Class D with another toy identical to the one that had been bargained away from him. However, as soon as he named the new toy Mopsy, it too disappeared, once again causing the inmate a great deal of emotional distress. Further testing found that there was little that could damage the furniture of SCP-738. Foundation researchers even tried exposing it to explosives to no effect. Despite appearing to be crafted from mahogany, neither the desk nor the chairs were able to catch fire and burn. Gunshots did not tear through the woodwork as one would expect, and even a mechanical wood chipper did nothing to cause even the slightest of damage. There was, however, one thing that did. When directly attacking the desk with an axe, a single gash was left scored into the mahogany surface by the bladed head. This did, unfortunately, lead to the death of the personnel wielding said axe, and afterwards the mark left in the desk began gradually healing. Changing their approach, the Foundation ceased sending Class D personnel to make deals with whatever devil appeared sitting at the desk. Instead, a researcher took the seat opposite, and before the entity began its usual stream of offers to fulfill deep desires, the researcher asked a simple question: "What are you?" The SCP-738 entity took the form of a huge snake and answered, "I'm sorry. It's against policy to divulge personal details, but may I interest you in..." It is unknown what the entity offered the researcher, but the session was called to be halted shortly after, and the Foundation researcher was institutionalized pending psychiatric review. The final test of SCP-738 involved a Mr. Sheldon Katz, senior counsel of the Foundation's legal department, who presented the entity with a fully legally watertight document, stating he was not acting on behalf of the SCP Foundation and was testing SCP-738 of his own free agency. Mr. Katz reported that, in this instance, the SCP-738 entity assumed the form of a professor who had taught Sheldon during his first year of law school, but didn't include any information as to what sort of deal the entity had offered him. After 41 hours of debate, during which a 900-page-long agreement between him and SCP-738 was drafted, Mr. Katz eventually passed out from sheer, overwhelming exhaustion. A red leather envelope was found on him when he was removed from the testing room, containing a handwritten note and smelling heavily of sulfur. The note simply read, "Please come back anytime. I haven't had so much fun in years." The incidents involving SCP-738 all follow a strikingly similar pattern. After adjusting to the person before it, both appearing in a form specific to them and communicating with them in such a way that they will best understand, the SCP-738 entity will attempt to entice their latest emptor with their deepest desires. When the person opposite them makes a request, the entity brings up the question of price. While they can be negotiated with, it will insist that the price be of equal value to what is being requested, like for like, perhaps even a soul for a soul. It is worth noting that the entity that sits in that throne will not always follow through on deals if they determine the person making the request does not want the object enough, or if they request an object for someone else as a way of trying to dodge paying the full price. It seems that this entity, being the bargainer that it is, does not indulge requests that are made to affect other people, or for items that can easily be passed on to others. Accepting a deal with whatever devil appears across that desk from you will make your wish come true. Isn't that how deals with the devil always go? After all, you are certain to get whatever you ask for, anything your heart desires, if you're willing to pay the right price for it. Just make sure that you always read the fine print of that agreement before you sign, because the price won't always be something you're willing to pay. There is a dangerous creature that could be anywhere in the world, hiding in plain sight, casually walking through crowded streets filled with people. A monster that is nearly impossible to see, blending into its surroundings almost perfectly. Not invisible, but unnoticeable, almost completely undetectable. But then you spot a familiar outfit in a crowd. You now know where the creature is, but it goes both ways. Since the moment you find it, it knows where you are. There is now not a single place on the earth that you could hide where it wouldn't find you, and it won't ever stop looking. To the staff at the Foundation, this creature is known as SCP-4885, but you and I know him by a different name. You may have seen his face hundreds of times, or stared for hours at a page trying to catch a glimpse of him. To us, he's Waldo. While this might feel like a very long-winded and silly joke, maybe even a prank that has been inserted into the SCP archives, it is anything but.
If you grew up any time after the late 1980s, then you will likely be familiar with the Where's Waldo books. But for the uninitiated, there are a series of puzzle books created by illustrator Martin Hanford. Each book in the Where's Waldo line contains multiple double-page spreads of colorful, crowded scenes. The goal is for readers to spot the ever-elusive titular character, Waldo, who is hidden among the mass of other characters. Waldo himself is easily recognized, thanks to a design that has become truly iconic over the years. He is always depicted as wearing a red and white striped shirt, with a bobble hat in matching colors. Waldo also sports jeans, circular rimmed glasses, and sometimes a wooden walking stick. So with that important context out of the way up front, what exactly is SCP-4885? Is the character from these children's books somehow brought to life? Has the character of Waldo always been a malicious, malevolent entity too powerful to be contained within his own books? Well, not exactly. SCP-4885 only seems to resemble the famous children's book character. Whether or not he is the living manifestation of Waldo in the real world is both unclear and up for debate. Examining its outward appearance, SCP-4885 does share the humanoid shape and looks to be wearing the same recognizable clothing of Waldo. There are, however, two notable bodily dissimilarities between the Waldo on the page and the physical form of SCP-4885. For one, this Waldo appears to be much paler to the one found in the book series. More noticeably, however, is the fact despite wearing the same circular glasses, SCP-4885 seems to have no eyes. Should a person learn of SCP-4885's current location, Waldo will simultaneously gain an awareness of this person. Learning instantly of their victim's location, SCP-4885 will traverse any space necessary, tracking their target down to anywhere they might be in the world. The creature has displayed a number of space-altering abilities, including teleportation. SCP-4885 can also alter the state of his own matter, allowing Waldo to phase through solid surfaces. No obstacle can stop his advance. Not walls, not buildings, not even his victim's own body. When SCP-4885 finally reaches the person who has learned of his location, Waldo will then proceed to murder them in an exceptionally excruciating manner. Using his matter-changing abilities, he will teleport or phase himself inside his victim, pulling himself through their body and destroying their internal organs. After causing catastrophic bodily damage, SCP-4885 will then wrench their victim's jaw open, unhinging it with enough force to climb his way out of their mouth, leaving them dead, their body completely mangled. However, this isn't even the final stage of Waldo's attack. There is a strange byproduct left after a fatal encounter with SCP-4885, a yellow liquid that is produced as Waldo exits his victim's body. When this substance comes into contact with the deceased person's skin, it triggers a bizarre change. The liquid will cause their bodies to change after death, their skin becoming covered in symbols. On closer inspection, it becomes clear that these symbols are illustrations, exactly like the ones found in the pages of Where's Waldo. These corpses, referred to by the Foundation as instances of SCP-4885-1, will then start to act in a similar manner to SCP-4885, and anyone who sees one or learns of its location will cause Waldo to come looking for them. The Where's Waldo scenes left on a deceased victim's skin cannot be washed off or otherwise removed, and the only way to undo an instance of SCP-4885-1 is to skin an infected body after death. However, this creates a whole new problem. If someone was to attempt this, in doing so they would know the location of one of Waldo's victims. This knowledge would mean that whomever was trying to skin one of these bodies would themselves become Waldo's next target, and would likely end up just another instance of SCP-4885-1. In other words, it would be an exercise in futility. Naturally, the nature of visibilities and attack patterns make it difficult for the SCP Foundation to contain Waldo. SCP-4885 cannot be harmed through the use of firearms or other common conventional weapons at the Foundation's disposal. You might be forgiven for thinking that making a handful of people aware of where to find Waldo at the same time would be a viable solution. After all, he cannot be in multiple places at once, so perhaps he'd be unable to kill these individuals simultaneously. However, SCP-4885 has shown to be able to cope with this approach, dispatching his victims one at a time, transforming each in turn into Where's Waldo printed corpses before continuing to the next would-be victim. If the victim is nearby, Waldo will force himself into their mouth, passing through their body and destroying bones, organs, and even the spinal column. When his victim is further away, Waldo will phase through the nearest wall and attack them, teleporting into his target and then climbing out of their mouth. Waldo's location, or that of his victims' bodies, are considered info hazards. Simply being aware of this information will cause SCP-4885 to activate. As a result of this, the staff at the SCP Foundation are not even sure that Waldo is actually contained at all. In theory, SCP-4885 is being held at an undisclosed Foundation site within a non-designed containment chamber, since even a number on the door would tip off what's inside, triggering Waldo's abilities. But here's the clincher, because nobody can know for sure where Waldo is without him coming for them. Nobody at the Foundation actually knows where he's being contained, if he's even contained at all. It is worth noting that, if someone receives a vague, non-specific description of Waldo's whereabouts, that he will make no attempt to seek them out. If he is contained, and if he was to ever breach containment, then the SCP Foundation has an entire set of procedures in place to ensure that no one ever finds Waldo. First, 36 containment chambers identical to the one SCP-4885 is supposedly held in are connected to a self-driving vehicle. An expendable D-Class personnel member is placed into the vehicle and a random number generator will select a number from 1 to 36. The self-driving vehicle will then arrive at the containment chamber chosen at random and the D-Class placed inside. Within each chamber are digital monitors, and once the D-Class is inside the chamber, all of these monitors will display the current location of SCP-4885. The Foundation has kept a GPS tracking device implanted within Waldo, but this information is normally kept secret to avoid any containment breaches. The D-Class essentially acts as bait for Waldo, forcibly given the knowledge of his location so that SCP-4885 will consider them a target. As part of the next phase of containment, Foundation staff will wait, giving Waldo enough time to arrive in the containment chamber and dispatch the D-Class within. After this, all of the 36 containment chambers are transported to random Foundation sites in disguised trucks, so that no one is sure where SCP-4885 ends up. Every time SCP-4885 breaches containment, the entire procedure has to be repeated. The Foundation first encountered SCP-4885 a number of years ago, inside a small wooden house, the exact location of which has since been expunged from all the SCP Foundation's records. While on assignment to secure an entirely different anomaly, the Foundation's Mobile Task Force Chi-19, also codenamed Unrelenting Punishment, were the first to discover Waldo. The three-person unit consisted of Foundation operatives named Amelia Merrick, James Klein, and Kurt Stoll. The trio cautiously entered the wooden house where they were meant to investigate reports of an anomalous inanimate object, a pair of black spectacles. According to initial intelligence gathered by the SCP Foundation, these glasses were capable of killing anyone that tried to wear them, leaving their body covered in pictures like those found in the children's book. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It is unknown if these black spectacles are the same eyewear worn by SCP-4885, but it doesn't seem like too far of a leap to assume that this may well have been the case. Searching the ground floor, the team had found no sign of the object they had been sent to recover. As Amelia, Kurt, and James made their way upstairs, something began making scraping sounds beneath them, but none of them noticed. In an abandoned bedroom on the upstairs floor of the house, Kurt spotted a drawing on the wall, which looked to have been made using crayons. He took a photo of the illustration, and this image is still kept in the Foundation's database. It appears to be a child's drawing, depicting SCP-4885 wearing his signature striped shirt and hat, with empty, vacant eyes. Next to it was scrawled one simple phrase: Waldo, found Mommy. Continuing their way through the house, the team located the glasses they were looking for in an upstairs bathroom. However, as James bagged up the spectacles, ready for transport back to the Foundation, Kurt spotted another inscription on a nearby wall, one that the team were certain hadn't been there when they had arrived. James stepped in to translate using the Foundation's standard issue translation device. The phrase on the wall read, "The basement. The corpses from a child's book are in the basement. He is there too. And we're sure that you can already guess what happened after that." Immediately after reading these words, James began to groan and clutched at his stomach, showing signs of extreme pain. Before Amelia or Kurt had any chance to figure out what was happening to their squadmate, fingers began protruding from James's mouth. They gripped his jaw and pulled it apart with enough force to send his jawbone flying across the room. SCP-4885 climbed its way out of James's body, and Amelia and Kurt both opened fire on the creature. Waldo did not react, seemingly unfazed by the gunfire and sustaining no damage as he approached Amelia, who would be his next victim. Shoving his fingers into her throat, Waldo wrenched apart Amelia's jaw, breaking it before he clawed his way into her mouth. As he watched in horror, Kurt made a panicked call for help to the Foundation, but it was too late. Waldo had already dispatched both James and Amelia, and now Kurt was about to pay the same terrible price. Ever since this incident, the Foundation believes that they have SCP-4885 contained. When his file was created, their researchers created an automated algorithm designed to wipe away any mention of SCP-4885's current location or the house he was discovered in from Foundation records. With SCP-4885 now assumed to be contained, that only leaves one question. The same burning inquiry that's been plaguing man for decades. Where's Waldo? In this case, maybe it's safer if you didn't know.
Death. That terrible and inevitable consequence of life. But as the Foundation discovered in the aftermath of Project Dammerung, its absence can be even more horrifying than its presence. Let's bring you up to speed, shall we? Here's the story so far. After the death of Overseer 05-11, the SCP Foundation's infamous O5 Council learned the horrifying truth of what happens to human beings after death. There is no afterlife, no everlasting paradise or eternal damnation. Instead, the dead are cursed to remain conscious, aware of everything happening to them after passing, even their bodies decomposing. To combat this, a member of the Council, 05-4, established Project Dammerung. This was an internal Foundation-backed endeavor, created with one singular goal in mind: to capture and contain death itself. As part of this project, researchers created a machine known as SCP-3448. At first, it seemed like just an ordinary MRI machine from a hospital. SCP-3448 had a number of anomalous modifications made to it, giving it a rather unique function. The device was capable of separating someone's consciousness from their body, putting them in a sort of half-dead state. While in this state, a subject placed within the machine, referred to as SCP-3448-A, could maintain a consistent line of two-way communication between their disembodied consciousness and the Foundation. Instead of deploying a member of D-Class personnel, one of the SCP Foundation's own agents was placed into SCP-3448. Agent Anthony Michaels was elected to act as SCP-3448-A and serve as the conduit between the living world and the endless nothing that lies beyond. But as often happens when people dabble with forces they cannot possibly understand, something went awry. Project Dammerung's mission to contain death took an unexpected turn. When Agent Michaels was placed into the machine, things ended up getting much, much worse. Buckle up, because we're about to dive into the ill-fated outcome of the death-defying Project Dammerung, the catalyst for the end of death itself. One of the components connected to SCP-3448 is a monitor. This screen is used to interpret the electrical activity of SCP-3448-A's brain once they have entered the half-death state, known as SCP-3448-1.
This component of the anomalous MRI machine is able to intake these electrical signals and interpret them as images, occasionally with words accompanying them too. During his time in the machine, Agent Michael's brainwaves were able to deliver some rather interesting imagery to the Foundation researchers. A number of these seemed to be a bizarre and seemingly disconnected series of images, almost like something taken directly out of a dream, hard to find any real context for. The first was a human figure, surrounded by a swarm of buzzing insects. After 43 minutes, the monitor connected to SCP-3448 showed this figure looking swollen, as if it had been stung by the insects, which flew away as the obscured humanoid collapsed. The next day, the screen showed a man lying alone in a desert somewhere, with an oasis in the distance. Almost like the classic mirage, someone dying of thirst sees just out of reach as they stumble through the endless sand dunes. The same day, the image changed to a man in a fetal position, in a room made of dirt with bones and roots protruding from the walls. So far, the dreamlike images coming through from Agent Michael's half-dead mind look strange, almost like the contents of the infamous videotape from the horror movie The Ring. Did any of these images mean anything? And if so, what? Was the man, the human-shaped figure appearing in them, Agent Michael's himself? Or some kind of representation of his disembodied consciousness, now that it had been separated from him by the SCP-3448 machine? One of the Foundation's researchers described the imagery seen on the monitor as being akin to watching someone's acid trip for over a week. However, the same researcher also theorized that because Agent Michaels was being held in a half-dead state, that the other things appearing in the images with him could also be similarly half-dead. The researcher believed that what they were seeing was more of an abstract, conceptual representation of death, not a conventional afterlife, like the idea of walking up to the pearly gates or the fire and brimstone of hell. So the researcher decided to try half-killing objects, partially disassembling things and placing them into SCP-3448 with Agent Michaels. Sure enough, doing this meant that the man in the images now had whatever object was put into the machine. For example, when they broke apart a lighter, it appeared in the man's possession on screen. Unfortunately, this was the biggest mistake that the researcher could have made. The images on the monitor began to show the man, now believed to be Agent Anthony Michaels, being attacked by a little girl. Thought to be a manifestation of the very concept of death, this girl was seen stabbing the agent with a femur, torturing him while the Foundation were sat watching, powerless and unable to help. The researcher requisitioned a handgun, partially disassembling it like the lighter in order to arm Agent Michaels against his attacker, and it worked. But the consequences were unfathomable. Sure enough, Michaels was able to draw the firearm and fend off his attacker. The agent fired off a shot that, over the course of more bizarre, creepy, and disjointed images involving skeletons and teddy bears, seemed to hit the girl square in the head. The image that followed showed Agent Michaels standing alone in a garden, flowers blooming as dead insects rained down around him. On the ground beside the agent was a stuffed animal, a crow with a bullet hole through its head. Shortly after, the following words appeared on the monitor attached to SCP-3448. "I hope you enjoy your hike, Dad." For a few short moments, nothing seemed to be all that different to the Foundation and the outside world. The researcher who had provided Agent Michaels with the handgun was trapped in a state of shock for a brief while, until 5 minutes later when the phone calls started flooding in. The first came from Joyce, a woman known to the researcher who frantically explained how her father, who had been dying, now was totally fine all of a sudden. The researcher couldn't quite tell if she was happy or terrified by what seemed to be happening. Next came the orders from above. The Overseer, 05-4, the only council member aware of Project Dammerung and who had backed it financially, called to congratulate the researcher and the rest of the team behind the project. It seemed that Dammerung had been successful in the goal they had set out with, to contain the cognito hazard known as death. 05-4 demanded that all records and information regarding the project was to be incinerated, covered up from the rest of the Foundation's knowledge. But the truth was far, far worse than any at the Foundation realized. It soon dawned on the researcher, who had been documenting Agent Michael's time in SCP-3448, that Project Dammerung had not succeeded at all. They hadn't contained anything, hadn't secured the conceptual form of death. What they had done instead by foolish mistake was neutralize death. They had killed death itself, and now the world as they knew it was gone, changed almost indefinitely. Now not a single person in the world could die. They had caused the end of death. On the surface, a world without death sounds like a utopia, a blissful society where everyone on Earth lives a long and prosperous life. But those with a little more foresight will know that peaceful immortality for the human race is a fool's dream. Think about how many people there are living in the world right now. The overall global population grows exponentially every year. While death might be a sad and somber part of life, it is unfortunately necessary. Even with all the deaths that occur worldwide every year, the resources of planet Earth are still being stretched thin. Water, oil, food, electricity, homes, everywhere you go, there are plenty of people who don't have enough of any. So what happens when people don't die, just keep aging infinitely? What happens when the Earth becomes too overcrowded? When the number of people overshadows the number of resources even more than it already does? Society as we know it across the globe would collapse. And that's exactly what happened. The Foundation had done the unthinkable. They had vanquished the very concept that takes us from being alive to being deceased. But there's a reason Kilroy J. Oldster called death the great equalizer of human beings. It is meant to catch up with everyone. Every person born is ultimately destined to die. And by removing that element of human mortality from the equation, the SCP Foundation had unknowingly pushed the world towards disaster. With the actions of Agent Michaels within SCP-3448, death as a concept ceased to exist, almost instantaneously, as if someone had flipped an off switch. People didn't become undead. Things that had long since passed away and been confined to 6 feet under the dirt didn't start clawing their way back up to the surface. We aren't talking about a zombie outbreak. This isn't Dawn of the Dead. Instead, human beings across the world just refuse to die. Their brains continuing to function and bodies continuing to age, despite any damage or injuries they sustained. Fatal wounds were now just as dangerous as getting a broken ankle or sprained wrist. The concerns about how undying humans were overpopulating the planet were also extended to animals too, which were also affected by the end of death that Project Dammerung had triggered. As a result, the threat of starvation on a potentially global scale was greater than such a concern ever had been. Of course, the SCP Foundation left the concerns of a potential humanitarian crisis to those in charge of world governments. The United Nations could worry themselves over how to feed and care for a population that simply won't die. The Foundation had bigger fish to fry. Their mistake had caused this situation, so only they could undo it. The only solution they could come up with? Figuring out new ways of killing people. The Foundation wanted to bring death back to the dead. Their experiments began with the use of D-Class personnel, commanding them to attempt to kill one another through various means. Strangulation, both by hand or with the use of a belt, didn't seem to work the way it should have, with the D-Class being strangled, likely going into a coma due to a lack of oxygen to their brain. Not dying, but living in unconscious agony. In a similar experiment, placing a D-Class in a vacuum led to burst blood vessels, impaired motor functions, widespread paralysis, to name a few forms of damage. But still, death could not be achieved. Cutting, blood loss, poisoning, starvation, shooting, even decapitation of multiple D-Class personnel all yielded the same result. In some sense, simply allowing these subjects to die might have just been kinder, if death was still possible, that is. The Foundation even went as far as removing the brain of a live monkey, placing it in a blender, and testing to see if there was any electrical activity present. And wouldn't you know, it was somehow still alive. At least as far as life can be measured by human beings. This key part of our existence, the underlying fact of death itself, was no more. Removing that was like taking a crucial element out of a circuit. The world just didn't function in the way it was supposed to anymore. What hope did the Foundation have now? What could possibly be done to solve this colossal mistake? Well, the answer is very little, apart from waiting for the inevitable collapse of society. What awaited was a world in ruin, where everyone was starving but nobody could die. A planet and a people just hanging on until the universe eventually blinked out of existence, so that maybe then they could rest in peace. The moral of this story? You can't cheat death, because death isn't the other player, it's the game itself. Many children across the English-speaking world grew up hearing Mother Goose nursery rhymes about mice running up clocks, old women living in shoes, and one unfortunate egg by the name of Humpty Dumpty. But have you ever heard the rhyme about the Crooked Man? Most of us who heard that particular poem remember it like this. There was a crooked man, and he walked a crooked mile. He found a crooked sixpence against a crooked stile. He bought a crooked cat which caught a crooked mouse, and they all lived together in a little crooked house. A little bit odd, but hey, most nursery rhymes are. When have you ever seen a little girl sitting on a tuffet eating some curds and whey? What even is a tuffet? Honestly, what are curds and whey? Let's just move on. Residents of the sleepy English hamlet of Tenby in Oxfordshire hear a more menacing version of the rhyme about the Crooked Man, sung as a song on playgrounds, shared in hushed tones when the grown-ups aren't listening. It goes like this. There lived a crooked man who made a crooked deal. He kept a crooked cane and his catch in crooked creel. He stole a crooked child who cried a crooked squeal, and that crooked little man was broken on the wheel. It sounds just as inscrutable as any other nursery rhyme, but there is a dark tone to it that seems a bit out of place, especially when you compare it to the other somewhat cheery version. This creepy alternative to the Crooked Man nursery rhyme seems to only be found in the town of Tenby, and unfortunately for the residents of that town, there is a deadly truth behind its words. Many years ago, the SCP Foundation became aware of a mysterious pattern in this unassuming town. Every 12 years, over a period of roughly 70 days, something horrible would happen to townspeople who happened to be alone and indoors after dark. When they were discovered by a neighbor, a family member, a friend, or even the police, they would be unresponsive, suffering from full-body paralysis, or appearing to be effectively brain-dead. This was not the most unusual aspect of the phenomenon, though. The victims were all grotesquely transformed, their long bones covered in dozens of compound fractures, combined with excess cartilage and osseous tissue. Their limbs would become distended, stretched, and deformed into long, gnarled appendages like the limbs of an ancient tree. One of the recovered victims had a forearm measured at over 2.4 meters long. Another had to be placed in a specially outfitted hospital bed, as his spine and legs had stretched to the point where he was 12.5 meters tall. Local police and doctors alike were left scratching their heads. What had happened to these people? Clearly something horrible had been done to them, but there was no actual evidence of a crime. No one had been murdered, and there was no evidence of forced entry at any of the victims' homes. There was, however, one other piece to the crooked puzzle. Just before a victim was found, their place of residence would visibly degrade and warp, the structure itself breaking in places until portions collapsed in or became slanted. Roofs would tilt at an unsafe angle, chimneys would fold over, and door frames would twist until no ordinary person could pass through them safely. This happened every 12 years for decades, and none of the people of Tenby could do anything about it. In fact, they rarely ever so much as spoke of it, terrified of admitting the truth of their town's curse in so many words. Instead, they spoke about the phenomenon in innuendo, meaningful glances and pleas to keep loved ones company at night, and through a simple children's rhyme. One doctor tasked with treating survivors of the horror decided to do something as the 12-year mark began to approach once more. He reached out to a researcher he had known years ago, a man who specialized in the unexplained, things that modern medicine had no answer for. This man had left medicine behind and was now working for the SCP Foundation. At the time of contact, there were approximately 6 months to go until the phenomenon would begin to strike once more. The Foundation needed to act quickly in order to collect more information and hopefully find a way to stop the terror of Tenby once and for all. With about a month to go until the danger would reappear, a member of D-Class personnel referred to as D-209 was placed in a Foundation-owned house in town. Audio and visual equipment were installed throughout the house in order to monitor it for any anomalous activity and to make sure D-209 remained at his post. For the first month of his stay, D-209 did not experience anything unusual. He spent his time drinking tea, baking pies, and catching up on his reading. He even thanked the Foundation for the unexpected staycation. Unfortunately, on his 43rd day in Tembe, things changed. As D-209 sat in bed reading a novel by the lamplight, the camera feed in the living room began to glitch. A vertical distortion appeared with a jagged pattern that began to make its way across the room from the front door. It was as if something was coming inside, but the camera could not pick up its image. The distortion continued through the hallway until the camera placed there cut out entirely. D-209 suddenly closed his book as the sound of scratching came from the floor below. He began to slowly climb out of bed, listening for further sounds as the entity continued to make its way through the house toward him. Movement was apparent on the video feed, but there was too much interference for any image of the creature to be made out. D-209 froze in his tracks as he heard footsteps, slow and certain, coming up the stairs toward him. He ran to the window, attempting to pry it open and make an escape, but it would not budge. With increasing desperation, he grabbed his bedside lamp and threw it at the window, attempting to shatter the glass. The lamp broke apart, but the window remained stubbornly intact. As he scrambled for an escape route, something knocked at his bedroom door. D-209 called out toward the door. "Who is it? Who's there?" But there was no response. "Identify yourself!" Still, whatever stood on the other side said nothing. Holding the remains of the lamp in one hand as a makeshift weapon, D-209 slowly reached for the doorknob and opened the door. With a sudden pop, every light bulb in the vicinity burst, including Foundation-provided floodlights positioned outside of the house. There was the sound of snapping and then an agonized scream. The camera adjusted to the lack of light in the room, allowing for a clear image of D-209. He was wailing and holding his right arm, which appeared to be broken just above the elbow. The arm began to stiffen and elongate, indicating impossibly fast bone growth. "Screw this! You're not taking me! I'm getting out of here alive!" he yelled, running down the hallway. He collapsed as another snapping sound echoed throughout the hall. "My leg's broken! Send help, please!" He called to someone, anyone who might be watching the feed. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself to his feet. He lifted his right arm to the camera, showing that it had been broken again below the elbow, pointing in the opposite direction of the first break. "What are you doing? Help me!" he screamed. It doesn't even hurt anymore! That can't be right! I don't know what's happening to me!" As he continued to yell at the cameras, he limped towards the stairs, attempting to make his way down to the first floor. He missed a step, lost his balance, and fell all the way down. 12 loud snaps were heard as he went. When he landed on the ground, his bones were broken in several other places, only to be immediately set where they had broken as he screamed. He dragged himself into the living room, battling against his own body, which had become something foreign to him. His arms were growing longer, now around 2 meters long, and his legs stretched out of the camera's view, presumably into the hallway. Suddenly, he stopped crawling, his eyes widening. "No, no, no, no," he whimpered before suddenly being dragged backwards out of the camera's view. Due to the presence of the entity interfering with the cameras, all visibility was lost at this point. There was, however, still a live audio feed. The microphones picked up an hour of snapping and screaming until D-209 eventually went quiet. Then, all that could be heard was a wet, sucking sound, followed by a thumping. Meanwhile, at the hospital, 27 other victims of the entity were lying in hospital beds. As D-209 met his unfortunate fate, all of the hospitalized victims began to experience seizures at the same time and seized for several minutes. 5 patients were killed and 2 researchers were injured in the chaos. After the incident at the hospital, reports of a seismic event at the edge of town began to circulate. Because there had been no actual earthquake in the area, the research team realized that this disturbance had to be somehow related to the phenomenon. They planned to investigate in order to learn more about the entity behind it all, which they had now officially designated SCP-783, the Crooked Man. A team of personnel were sent to investigate the site of the seismic event, only to find a group of Tembe townsfolk clustered around the area in a field at the south of town. The crowd refused to let the researchers through and would not budge until one researcher, Agent Collins, pulled out her firearm and fired a shot into the air. The sound frightened the crowd, and they realized this mysterious foundation really meant business. Where the crowd had been, Agent Collins could see toes, unnaturally long, crooked toes, poking up out of the ground. They were going to need some help and a lot more shovels to uncover this mystery. By the next day, a dig team had uncovered a mass grave filled with victims of SCP-783. There were dozens of elongated bodies spread throughout the 5-meter-wide hole, stacked on top of each other with their heads facing down and their arms outstretched towards the bottom of the pit. Their limbs had grown around each other, twisting together to the point where they could not be removed one at a time. While trying to collect a tissue sample from one of the bodies, researcher Singer lost his balance as the ground beneath him gave way and he fell. He attempted to find a foothold and climb back up, but fell through the gnarled arms and down into the pit. Thinking quickly, Agent Collins grabbed a rope and tied it around her waist. She would lower herself down into the grave and would signal when she was ready for them to pull her out. Agent Collins descended into the pit, over 20 meters down, before she signaled for the team to pull her back out. Then she told them what she had seen. There was something down there, the entrance to another location beneath all of the bodies. Someone asked if there was any sign of researcher Singer. Collins shook her head, face growing pale. She hadn't seen him down there. He was gone. Agent Collins was granted a temporary leave of absence, and a D-Class, D-2172, was selected for further exploration of the anomalous mass grave. He was outfitted with a retractable harness, communication and video equipment, as well as a photoionization detector, a Geiger counter, a basic survival kit, a firearm, and ammunition. D-2172 was then lowered into the pit via a crane. After 12 meters of descent, there was no longer any visible light inside the pit, and D-2172 switched on his headlamp. A few moments later, D-2172 began tugging on the tether, demanding to be lowered more quickly. When asked why, he insisted, "Someone just touched my back." At 18 meters down, D-2172 began to feel a sense of confusion and dizziness, unable to tell which direction he was going. At this point in the pit, gravity had inverted, forcing D-2172 to climb upward in order to continue moving down as he crossed into another world. There was daylight visible here again, as D-2172 climbed out from within the mass of bodies. There he found a seemingly identical version of the town of Tembe. He was instructed to take soil samples, and the monitoring researcher noticed something odd on the video feed. There were marks in the dirt around the grave that appeared to have been made by fingers pulling across the ground. They decided not to relay this to D-2172. After the soil samples came up normal, D-2172 was instructed to walk to a nearby cottage and look for any sign of the missing researcher Singer. He knocked on the door, and with no answer let himself in. He saw no one inside, and began to walk through. In the bedroom on the wall, there was a charcoal sketch of a humanoid figure holding a staff of some kind. Command ordered him to approach the drawing, but he protested, saying he felt incredibly uncomfortable looking at it. He relented and began to approach, but as he did, the quality of the video feed began to degrade until it was filled with static. D-2172 was then permitted to leave the cottage and further explore this copycat village. While walking further into the village, D-2172 spotted a work boot on the ground. He picked it up and found it was a match for the one researcher Singer had been wearing. He followed the path to another house, the door of which was wide open. He walked inside to find signs of a struggle, an overturned couch and table, a hole in the wall, the broken pieces of a lamp scattered on the floor. The kitchen was just as much of a mess, and as he investigated it further, he found a pool of blood on the floor, with significant blood splatter on the walls and counter. It looked like someone had been attacked with a weapon, likely a knife. Indeed, as he looked, D-2172 spotted a butcher's block with only one empty slot. the one that should have held a meat cleaver. The investigation led him to a locked door, covered in scratches. He broke it down and nearly fell down the stairs into the darkened basement. Instructed to head down into the basement, D-2172 switched on his headlamp, drew his weapon, and descended into the darkness. The basement was empty except for a bloody meat cleaver and a piece of pant leg caught inside an exhaust vent leading out of the house. The pants resembled those worn by Singer before his fall. D-2172 peered into the vent for a closer look, but was startled by the sight of something scuttling out of sight. Whatever it was fleshy, and it was not something he cared to see more of. D-2172 continued on his expedition, walking north and away from the town limits of Tembe. Somehow, in spite of this, he wound back up at the south side, where he had emerged from the pit. But something was different. There were no bodies, no open grave, and no tethered harness that he had taken off when he climbed out. He was trapped. The harness had not been retracted, so where had it gone? Command could not determine its exact location, but proposed that D-2172 had entered another anomalous area and was not, in fact, back where he started. He was instructed to follow the road back, retracing his steps until he wound up at the pit again. As he walked, he commented that he had not yet seen a single living thing in this place. Then, as he heard the sound of rustling leaves, he turned toward it to find the corpse of an SCP-783 victim. He turned back to continue on his way, only to see another victim sprawled across the road. He drew his weapon then, listening as the rustling began again. He spun around to look at the body behind him and found that it had stretched longer, growing closer to him. Behind him, the other body began to snap as well. He turned to fire his weapon and saw that this other body had stretched its neck, its head at eye level, only a meter away from his own face. He fired several rounds, but the corpse did not respond. Ignoring orders, D-2172 took off running into the woods, leaving the road behind. He stopped to catch his breath, sat down, and reloaded his firearm. After eating a quick MRE and informing command of his whereabouts, he set back off on his journey through the forest. After 14 minutes of walking, he began to feel movement under the ground. Short, sharp bursts of motion reverberating through the earth. He could also hear a thumping sound coming from beneath him. On the video feed, Command saw what appeared to be a silver birch tree lifting out of sight, then dropping down back into the forest, shaking the ground on impact. D-2172 was instructed to approach the object, as Command quickly realized that this was no tree. As he approached, another similar object landed near him. He fired his weapon at it, and blood began to dribble from the wound, a scream ringing out high above him. Not knowing what else to do, he ran as fast as he could, begging for help from Command, for someone to do something to get him out of there. As D-2172 ran out of the forest, making his way back to town, another one of the long, pale objects knocked him onto his back. He looked up, now able to see what it was without the trees in his way. When he saw it, he couldn't help but scream. It was Researcher Singer, or at least it had once been Researcher Singer. He had become something else, something unthinkable. His body was up in the sky, balancing on enormous, impossibly long fingers. The creature that had once been Singer shrieked, lifting a finger and preparing to bring it down on D-2172. He fired several shots, but none hit, so again he turned and ran. He reached the main road and kept running, tasting bile in the back of his throat and feeling his lungs begin to burn. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, the creature would grab him in those awful fingers, and he didn't want to think about what would happen next. Then he saw it, the pit, the bodies, his way out. He sprinted toward the pit, almost there, when a screech rang out and a massive finger knocked him aside. The video feed was lost, with only the sound of D-2172 screaming and running away. After this, D-2172 was considered lost, and attending researcher Dr. Peterson ordered that the team pull his harness back out. Agent Collins protested, saying they had no evidence of D-2172's death. Peterson relented, and they waited for the signal. Eventually, it came. 2 tugs on the tether, D-2172 asking to be pulled out. But when they pulled the tether, an empty harness emerged. Something was caught on it, holding it in the pit as the team tried to draw it out. It was D-2172's hand, gripping the harness as hard as it could. The harness broke free from his grasp, and his hand flailed, searching for his chance at escape. Another D-Class rushed to help, grabbing a hold of 2172's hand. Another D-Class joined in, along with Dr. Lafayette and Private Aoude, and the group worked together to pull the fallen man from the pit. Only as they pulled, they realized that only his arm had come out, and it was continuing to come. More and more and more of his arm, stretching out to 3 meters in length, bending and snapping at gruesome angles. They were too late after all. He was already gone. Despondent, the group released him, and he sank back down into the pit with the rest. There is currently no way for the Foundation to remove the Crooked Man from Tembe for containment. Instead, they must maintain a strong presence in the town, monitoring the community via a temporary Site-5. This area includes 2 houses and a building near the local hospital. Their Foundation officers will track any signs of SCP-783 activity, as well as continue to research the entity's nature and any potential weaknesses it may have. In the event that SCP-783 becomes active, all of its victims must be removed from the site of the attack. Their bodies must be incinerated, and they will be added to the case file. For now, there is not much anyone can do but wait and see, because the cycle isn't broken yet. It's only a matter of time. The Crooked Man is coming back to do his crooked deeds. Be thankful the Foundation knows what everybody needs. If you want to stay yourself, protect your muscle, flesh, and bone, then you'd better heed this warning. Don't stay home at night alone. There are many shows we remember fondly from our childhoods, from the adventures of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to the Saturday morning cartoons of the Flintstones or the Jetsons. But arguably the most famous of these cartoons is SpongeBob SquarePants, a show about an optimistic sea sponge and his daily life throughout his city of Bikini Bottom. We all know the same SpongeBob SquarePants in some way or some form. His popularity translated to a lot of merchandise. From plushes to lunchboxes and phone cases, SpongeBob is a staple of childhood and modern-day culture. While the SCP Foundation's world is one where monsters roam and anomalous events affect millions, SpongeBob and his merchandise is also popular within this universe. The SCP Foundation is most well known for its protection of normalcy and from the most extreme and dangerous threats. Anomalies such as SCP-1730, the Interdimensional Site-13, SCP-001 When Day Breaks, or SCP-682, the humanity-hating, hard-to-destroy reptile. These SCPs pose a direct, obvious threat to the people of the SCP universe. A lot of these anomalies have object classes that clearly state the danger level, along with their level of containment difficulty. Keter, Apollyon, Euclid, and more. Safe-class anomalies are not commonly thought of as dangerous, but what about those safe-class anomalies that were specifically made to be inconspicuously dangerous to humankind? Today, we take a deep dive into one such anomaly, and we don't mean scuba diving. Or do we? Anyhow, here's a look at SCP-1808, also known as the Spongebob Watches. Its containment procedures are almost too simple, but given it's a safe-class anomaly, it's all about the difficulty of putting it in a box and keeping it there, more than being about its danger level. There are 6 instances of SCP-1808, and all are kept in standard safe-class anomaly storage lockers in Safe Wing C at Site-25. This is similar to the containment procedures of SCP-662, the Butler's Handbell, which is also a relatively safe anomaly, all things considered. The containment procedures also mention that all testing outside of monitored environments is expressly prohibited. It begs the question, if this safe-class anomaly can be kept in simple storage lockers,
Why is there such a strict mandate against testing? What potential danger could SCP-1808 pose that these restrictions are placed on it? Well, to properly answer all of your amazingly inquisitive questions, we need to look back on the story of how SCP-1808 came into the Foundation's possession to begin with. In early April of 2004, the Foundation was alerted to an ongoing anomalous item auction from the anomalous group of interest, Marshall, Carter, and Dark. Anomalous groups of interest within the SCP Foundation's universe are all but rare. From the malicious Chaos Insurgency that works to harm the Foundation by utilizing anomalies as weapons, to SCP-610, which uses Yaldabaoth worshipping Sarkic cults that work to bring humankind back to a primal way of living. These groups are known for their use of the anomalous for executing their plans. And as we've seen time and time again on this channel, by pretty much any means they deem necessary. Let's just say there are not many boundaries set. Or none. Let's go no boundaries. Moving on. When it comes to Marshall, Carter, and Dark, however, they are a bit different from these groups. Instead of calling upon the starfish god like the Fiftists, or rebuilding the god of technology, Mechane, like the Church of the Broken God, Marshall, Carter, and Dark have one motive: profit. This group is solely dedicated to selling and profiting from the anomalous, whether it be through selling to the highest 1% of the 1%, or contracting their anomalies out to other anomalous organizations for high payments. Marshall, Carter, and Dark is in the world of leveraging the anomalous for money, and as much money as possible. The SCP Foundation normally has a somewhat cordial relationship with Marshall, Carter, and Dark, sometimes even purchasing anomalies from the group for containment purposes. However, Marshall, Carter, and Dark often overstep these boundaries, causing the SCP Foundation to have to intervene and steal anomalies from them. The story of SCP-1808 is one of these times the Foundation had to step in. An agent of Mobile Task Force ETA-2, buyer beware, Agent Rosser was working covertly within the ranks of Marshall, Carter, and Dark, attaining information that may be needed for the SCP Foundation's containment efforts. Agent Rosser was, of course, under strict protocols set forward by the SCP Foundation. He was to keep them updated with any movements Marshall, Carter, and Dark may be making, noting any potential anomalies that may need containing, and as always, making sure to be checking in every day. On April 4th, Agent Rosser failed to do his required check-in, and the Foundation immediately deployed other buyer beware MTF agents to his last known location, a Marshall, Carter, and Dark auction house. The raid commenced, and the SCP Foundation, having some of the most highly trained and sophisticated soldiers and agents in the world, swiftly took the upper hand, restraining and apprehending members of Marshall, Carter, and Dark, and their potential buyers. A large-scale search then commenced for Agent Rosser within the auction house, where he was found seated behind a curtain with all 6 instances of SCP-1808 attached to his body, 1 on each of his wrists and ankles, and 2 fastened together around his neck. Agent Rosser was found in a state that could only be described as pure torment. He was unrecognizable. The bones of his fingers and toes were so elongated they circled back onto themselves. The skin of his hands and feet were torn to shreds from the force of whatever was pulling at them. The Foundation-issued boots Agent Rosser wore were ripped as well to make way for the bones. And possibly most ghastly of all, his teeth had grown out of his mouth, tearing the skin of his cheeks and jaw. Could it be that these simple Spongebob watches were the cause of his torture? There were no other obvious threats observed that could possibly be the cause of these changes to his body. This made the Foundation suspicious and worried. What else could be in store for them? The SCP-1808 file described the anomaly as a set of 6 yellow plastic wristwatches. These watches are patterned, with green dots scattered along the watch body, along with images of the famous cartoon character SpongeBob SquarePants. The first anomalous property of SCP-1808 is that no matter what mechanical or electronic parts are removed, the watch still operates as if it's perfectly intact. The most dangerous part of SCP-1808 is when it's placed on a person or animal. As long as the wearer has limbs and phalanx bones, SCP-1808's main anomalous property will affect them. Once put on, SCP-1808 cannot be removed, unless the person who put it on decides to take it off. Once placed, those wearing SCP-1808 will hear a chime of SpongeBob's famous or infamous chuckle every 15 minutes. If hearing that wasn't suffering enough, SCP-1808's anomalous property will now begin to affect the wearer. After the laugh is heard, the bones in whatever hand the person is wearing SCP-1808 will begin to grow in length. Every 15 minutes, as long as SCP-1808 is worn, these bones will extend about 6 centimeters until the watch is removed. The skin around the bones does not grow, so once they get long enough, the bones will tear through and rip the skin to continue growing. While there is no blood loss once this happens, those who have worn SCP-1808 describe the growing as immensely painful. These changes do not have to be permanent. Should the person that placed it on the poor soul who has to suffer these consequences feel a bit of mercy, they can retract the adjustment knob of the watch and rotate it counterclockwise. Upon doing this, the bones will begin to shrink back to their original size, and the ripped and torn skin will anomalously heal back to its normal state, as if SCP-1808 never affected it. While the physical harm that SCP-1808 inflicts on its victims can be reversed, the memory of the pain and torment the victims went through will be fully remembered, potentially causing further psychological torment even when the watches are removed. The item's description also includes the terrifying note that 2 instances of SCP-1808 can be placed around a subject's neck, and instead of lengthening any bones in the neck, it will instead mercilessly cause the victim's teeth to grow. In the case of Agent Rosser, we now know the suffering he was going through during his time as a spy for the SCP Foundation. Yikes. The potential danger these watches can pose if in the wrong hands, no pun intended of course, can be devastating. What if an authoritarian government purchased these anomalies? The torture SCP-1808 inflicts upon its victims could easily be used to squeeze information out of a person of interest. Same goes for the Chaos Insurgency, who could use these anomalies to attack the SCP Foundation and gain classified information only someone like a member of the Overseer Command would know. These anomalies had to be contained. The Foundation quickly restrained the Marshall Carter and Dark agent inflicting this horrible torture on Agent Rosser, and forced him to return Agent Rosser's deformities back to normal and hand over the watches. Questions circled in the Foundation's minds. Why was there no blood despite the amount of damage on Agent Rosser's skin? And why did the Marshall Carter and Dark agents do this to him in the first place? A Foundation doctor conducted an interview with Agent Rosser, with hopes to figure it all out. The doctor began with a simple statement. "Kindly summarize the events leading up to your abduction." Rosser answered, "There was nothing crazy about my abduction. I went to sleep in my flat and woke up tied to a table. Maybe I was drugged, but I'm not sure." This confused the doctor. Normally when an undercover SCP Foundation agent is discovered, they are not treated with the relative kindness Agent Rosser was shown. These groups, especially those such as Marshall Carter and Dark, normally want information, and will take that by any means necessary. The doctor continues with his questioning. "How did Marshall Carter and Dark come to discover your identity as a Foundation field agent?" Rosser chuckles. "I was never compromised as an agent. You see, I don't think they were even aware I was Foundation. If they were, they would have called off the auction and gotten their goods the hell out of there." He goes on to say that he didn't even tell his friends or family any details that would have made them suspicious of his rank in the Foundation. Once again, the doctor was extremely confused by this move on Marshall Carter and Dark's part. If they didn't know Agent Rosser was of the SCP Foundation, why did they torture him? The doctor asks this question to Agent Rosser. "If your identity wasn't compromised, why were you abducted and tortured?" Agent Rosser responds, "I think it was quality assurance. Testing the product, making sure it worked, experimenting with it, and if the raid hadn't happened, they would have put me on stage and demonstrated it." Like the SCP Foundation, Marshall Carter and Dark are more than willing to test out these anomalies on unwilling subjects. Perhaps they see their employees like the SCP Foundation sees the D-Class personnel. At least the D-Class personnel are death row inmates. They're people who committed heinous crimes, whereas Agent Rosser and his co-workers were innocent people trying to make a living. We see how brutal the world of a profit-driven anomalous group could be with what happened to Agent Rosser, and one could only imagine the horrifying torment the former employees of Marshall Carter and Dark may have went through under this so-called quality assurance. Agent Rosser continued with his story. He described the events leading up to the watches being placed on him. He drowsily awoke in the dark room strapped to a table. He recognized the room he was in as the basement. He looked to his left and then his right when his stomach dropped.
He wasn't the only one down there. Next to him were people he recognized as his co-workers, strapped to tables like him. After this realization, his shock turned to fear as senior members of Marshall, Carter, and Dark entered the room. "We are downsizing," one of them said to the helpless employees. They were going to use them as guinea pigs for their twisted testing of their products. Agent Rosser gets distracted, describing how much he used to enjoy the SpongeBob SquarePants television show. He watched it recently and found it funny, but now all he could think of is that laugh. Every 15 minutes, that laugh signified more torture, more torment that he had to be put through. Now he can't imagine watching the show without thinking of the torment SCP-1808 and Marshall, Carter, and Dark put him through. While the physical scars are gone, the mental ones still awfully remain. The doctor interviewing him requests that Agent Rosser stays on the topic of SCP-1808. The agent apologizes and continues. "First they just strapped the watches to my wrists and ankles and waited. After they were sure the things went off every 15 minutes, they started twisting the little knobs." He describes that he knew he was definitely being tested on. The Marshall, Carter, and Dark senior staff were observing these tests the entire time and even participated. The experimenters would twist the knobs mercilessly until the bones in his hands and feet tore free of the skin and hit the walls of the basement, only for them to crank them back and forth and begin the process all over again. You can only imagine how many times they did this to the agent, for no other purpose but quality assurance. Agents of the SCP Foundation are trained to withstand awful torture so that no confidential or important information is revealed to other groups of interest or the public. Agent Rosser, being trained by the Foundation, would know this training. He attempted to use his training methods to resist the torture, but sadly it wasn't enough. Agent Rosser states, "The pain was from the inside. The tips of my fingers were worn off and peeled back like an old pair of gloves. He was one of the lucky ones. Though the people chained to the tables in the same room he was in didn't survive whatever twisted torture they went through at the hands of Marshall, Carter, and Dark." The doctor realizes that part of Agent Rosser's story is being overlooked and states, "When you were discovered, two of the watches had been joined together and fastened around your neck." Agent Rosser is silent. This was clearly the most horrifying part of the entire ordeal for him. His silence persists for another minute, and the doctor calls his name. "Agent Rosser?" Rosser shakily begins. Apparently, the Marshall, Carter, and Dark senior staff weren't impressed with the effects of SCP-1808, despite the clear signs of pain and anguish from Agent Rosser. They thought it needed to be improved for a higher sale price. One of them suggested placing two of the watches around his throat. Rosser describes how his teeth began to grow. My teeth started getting longer, like my fingers and toes, but they didn't go straight. They went off in different directions. Some went inside." Rosser explains that all he could hear every time his teeth grew was that infamous SpongeBob laugh. He goes on to tell the doctor that this torture impressed the senior staff of Marshall, Carter, and Dark enough to continue with the sale. The memory of this makes Agent Rosser ill, and he vomits before he can even finish the thought. The doctor allows Agent Rosser to be dismissed. Hopefully he was provided with some Class A amnestics to forget this whole ordeal. The Foundation didn't contain SCP-3000 and harvest the Y-909 compound for nothing. The SCP-1808 file also includes a recovered auction catalog that Marshall, Carter, and Dark would have used to describe SCP-1808 to potential buyers. The description goes on to read, "These watches are the only products in existence with such uncanny abilities, and businesses or individuals wishing to carry out quick, efficient, and mess-free interrogations would be remiss in missing this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire them, as would our patrons with tastes for intimate sessions of impassioned discomfort." The starting bid on SCP-1808, only £14,600. Marshall, Carter, and Dark had no issues selling these watches to those who wanted to inflict awful torture on their unwilling and unknowing victims. And we thought the SCP Foundation was willing to stomp moral boundaries. All it took was a little motivation for profits, and Marshall, Carter, and Dark were shamelessly off to the races. For a few rather normal-looking SpongeBob-themed watches, SCP-1808 is truly a terrifying anomaly. Thanks to Agent Rosser's sacrifice, they are no longer on wrists and necks and are now in, shall we say, better hands with the Foundation. In the case of Marshall, Carter, and Dark, they suspended their morality to the point of testing the anomaly on their own employees. I guess this goes to show that profits over people is more than just a scary concept, even in the world of the SCP Foundation. Now go check out how does the SCP Foundation actually make money, and SCP-738 The Devil's Deal for more on anomalous business transactions that might just cost you more than you can bargain for.